right. Welcome, everybody, to another Friday Live call-in show. Good to have everyone with us today, this Friday afternoon for me, early afternoon for you as well. Well, actually, late afternoon for me, early afternoon for you, Alexander, in London. Hope everyone is doing well. Alexander, how are you doing this Friday?
I'm doing extremely well and delighted to be on this program, and we got much to discuss after we saw this wonderful press conference that happened, which we're going to talk about, no doubt, in great detail shortly. And I'm looking forward always to the great interactions we have with our viewers on this show.
All right. Great. And welcome to everybody in the live stream, in the chat. Hit that like button. Let's get those likes up as you enter the building. As you enter the room, hitting that like takes 1.343 seconds, Alexander, and it is completely free. So hit that like. Spartan Warrior Queen, moderating in the house, the best moderator in all of the YouTubes. How are you doing, Spartan Warrior Queen? Hope you are doing well. Thank you to everybody that has supported us this week. Thank you for your donations. I don't say that enough, but I will say that more often. Thank you very, very much for everything that you guys do. Thank you to everybody that has shopped at the Duran shop to pick up some great merch, hoodies, long sleeves, magic mugs. We've got all kinds of great things. The magic mugs, Alexander, are so magical that if Biden were to have had a magic mug with him during that press conference, he would not have needed any of the scripts, any of the cue cards. He would not have needed any of the help from his handlers. He would have actually been able to have gone through that press conference for a total, this is what I hear, a total of 4 hours if he had drank from those magic mugs. That's how magical these mugs are. So maybe we should send the White House maybe a dozen of our magic mugs and see if it helps out Joe Biden.
I think a dozen is about right. I think that given Joe Biden's needs and requirements, a dozen would be about what he would need to get himself into shape so that he could do a 4-hour press conference in the way that you said. He has a few, rather fewer than that. Well, you know, there might still be some problems. Too many, and of course he would probably go on, probably indefinitely, keeping us all up into the late hours, but a dozen, it seems to me, gets it exactly right.
Yeah, I'll send him some with the USA flag, but maybe I'll send some with the Russian flag as well. Maybe the Chinese
Russian flag. Well, the Chinese flag, definitely. I mean, he clearly has a great empathy with that country. I mean, he was talking about.
He did say he talked to Xi for 2 hours.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, he and Xi get on extremely well, it would seem, from the things that he says about Xi. So yes, I mean, Chinese flag, absolutely. I think that's entirely appropriate.
Okay, let's do a quick around the world as people enter the building here, enter the room. And let's see where people are joining us from. Welcome, Valies. Hope you're doing well. Valies says the magic mugs are terrific. Let's see. Longview, Texas is in the house. Bangkok is in the house. Let's see where else. Ordered my magic mug already. Great. You will love the magic mug. British Columbia in the house. Where else are people joining us from? Melbourne. Greetings to everybody in Melbourne. Lots of Greeks in Melbourne. Happy 200 bicentennial to all the Greeks all over the world. In the diaspora, we celebrated our independence. 200 years.
200 years, yes.
The Hellenic Republic, Alexander. So a day late, but yesterday was a big day for all the Greeks all around the world.
It was, and you know, we're going through some rather tough times in Greece at the moment, and as a nation we have, but we've been through many tough times before, far tougher in fact, and the fact that we are independent for 200 years reminds us of the fact that we've been through tough times and better times come, which they will.
Yeah, and I say that because there is a large diaspora of Greeks in Melbourne, Australia. Very, very large. I believe it's over 1 million Greeks are living in Melbourne. At least that's the last I heard. Let's see. Corn Pop was a bad dude, says Brian. I have a theory. I think Corn Pop was a younger Putin. That's my theory. Maybe. What do you think about that? All right. Let's see. Windsor, Ontario is in the house. Fiji is with us. Awesome. Great to have you joining us from Fiji. Bluebell, Pennsylvania. the great state of Pennsylvania, the great state of Florida, Syrian, born in Sweden. Good to have you with us. Baltimore, Maryland. Yes, I used to live in Baltimore for 1 year. Love that state. My brother got his master's in Baltimore as well. So I know Baltimore very well. Let's see, the Serbs in Serbia. Great to have everybody in Serbia. Lots of love to Serbia. Cleveland, Ohio. Awesome. Toms River, New Jersey. Chicago. Cambridge, UK. Alexander, you are joining us from London. How are things in the UK? From what I understand, and we'll get into the super chats real quick. We'll get some super chats going. We'll talk about the Ministry of Truth and Biden's press conference. But very, very quickly, Alexander, be very careful with the words that you use, because YouTube has banned a bunch of channels and they've demonetized. Actually, one of the channels that I really like, which is Rebel News, I hear that they demonetized them in Canada. But Alexander, I hear that Boris Johnson is now for getting the shot if you enter pubs and restaurants and supermarkets. What have you heard? Because it's been going back and forth on this issue.
It has, and there's been no resolution, and we may very well see things turn around and change again. But what I will say is the climate in Britain, the political and in climate and the sort of news climate, has become more restrictive. We had an incident about a week ago where there was a violent breakup by the police of a vigil in Clapham Common that had happened in commemoration of the murder of a woman which took place. What was interesting about that event was that particular vigil was attended by a member of the royal family, and yet nonetheless it was sort of cleared up.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely, Kate herself, indeed. Okay. And we've had this decision, this judgment by the High Court in Scotland in the case of Craig Murray, which I have to be extremely careful about, because, by the way, there are all sorts of legal restrictions on what you can say about it. But there's a lot about it that I find really rather discomforting and worrying, which no doubt we will touch on over the course of this programme. Then there is this extraordinary law that the British government is talking about passing, and may indeed pass, which is going to put very severe restrictions, it seems to me, on holding political protests in general. I mean, it basically says you can't hold a protest or a rally or a demo, however peaceful you are, if this causes inconvenience to people. I exaggerate, but if you read it, that's almost what it says. So it seems to me we've had a sudden and rather repressive turn, and what you were just referring to seems to me to be part of that. However, the thing to say about Boris is that he turns, with the prevailing wind, and it's not impossible that some of these bad ideas and bad things that have been floating around will be reversed if he realizes, if he senses that they're not going down very well with the British public. I mean, the British, in my experience, tend to be, like Americans, more likely to push back on things than is true in some other countries in Europe that I can think of. Germany, for example, though one shouldn't underestimate things in Germany, but other countries in Europe. So I wonder whether all of this will happen, will really crystallize in the way that it's being said. But having said that, lots of things in Britain that do bring up concerns.
All right. Greetings to everyone in Slovenia, Liverpool, Rio, Colorado, Jacksonville, Florida. Where else? South Africa, Ireland, Scotland. Alexander, let's do some real quick super chats, and let's get to the Biden press conference. Flying Board just came right into the house with a super chat update on Nord Stream 2. How long will it take to finish? Very quickly, Alexander, what is the update on Nord Stream 2? Do we have an update?
We do, but before I do that, can I quickly say to all our viewers that my apologies for the fact that I had to cut off towards the end of the live that we did last week. We've done another live recently, not a live, we've done a video in which we caught up with some of the super chats we didn't cover because I had to leave so abruptly last week. And this time there shouldn't be any such problems. No, Nord Stream 2, we've just had comments from Gazprom. They say definitely it will be finished this year. There was some talk, here we go. I mean, I'm looking at the TASS report. Works have been fulfilled by 90 to 92%. These are, I think, the additional works. So what Gazprom says be finalized this year. The active work is underway with quite a bit remaining to be done. It will surely be completed this year. Definitely. Zubkov, who is the chairman of the board of directors of Gazprom, told reporters on Friday. The works have been fulfilled by 90 to 92%. So it looks as if it's going to press on. Now, there's been a big head of steam in the United States, largely led, interestingly enough, by Ted Cruz, to try to pressure the Biden administration into imposing sanctions, which would basically stop Nord Stream 2 in its tracks. The Germans have pushed back against that. They've made it very clear that they want to see Nord Stream 2 done. Blinken issued a statement which said that, you know, any European company that gets involved in Nord Stream 2 is at risk of sanctions. But he so far hasn't announced anything further. And to the extent that I understand that Nord Stream 2 required construction or involvement in the construction by European companies, that's largely ended now, and also the financing too. So it seems that it's on a clear path now to being completed, and Gazprom seems to be confident that it will be completed. And there's these two Russian ships, the Fortuna and the Academic Chersky, which appear to be busy laying the pipes. So it looks as if it'll be done. I hear different dates all the time about when it will be completed by. Some say April, some say June, some say September. I suspect that this is all being done in order to keep the Americans off balance, and unsure what exactly is going on. But I'm sure it will be finished this year.
All right. I think I see Valley S was the first super chat, I believe. I'm looking at the list, but I can't quite get to the beginning. But in either case, it's always great to have Valley S with us. And thank you, Valley S, for all your support. Thank you. Peace, $20 super chat. Love you guys from Washington State. Great to have you here with us from Washington State. From Hunger, a $5 super chat. Would Greece be better off today under the monarchy, keeping local oligarchs in check, or would it be more dependent on the EU? Well, that's an interesting question.
Well, that's a very, 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 very interesting question. Now, I should say that my family were fairly well connected, or at least I should say a branch of my family, not all of them, were fairly well connected to the royal court when Greece was a monarchy. And my impression from speaking to those sort of people is that there were elements within the royal court which were actually very, very intimate and close to sections of what we might describe as the oligarchy, and tended to protect them. So the monarchy was not perhaps the check on the oligarchy that one might expect it to be. I doubt that bringing back the monarchy is going to be the solution to Greece's problems. And to be completely frank, I don't get the sense that with all the many problems that Greece has, there's a great deal of demand for it. I don't think it's going to happen. That's my sense anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Let's see. From Hungary, the forms of government have not changed since Plato. If the route out of our disgusting oligarchy is democracy, then won't it later result in tyranny?
There's a wonderful, fascinating study which appeared, I think, just before the First World War by an American scholar called Michels, which argued that every political system that exists, be it an autocracy, a democracy, always ultimately it evolves into an oligarchy. In fact, he coined a phrase which was the iron rule, the iron law of oligarchy. The idea is that in any political system, there are always powerful and privileged insiders who will eventually game the system to their own advantage. And whatever precautions and steps you take to try to prevent that, that's always and invariably the outcome you will get. It's an extraordinary, clever, powerful study. I don't go that far. I think that if you are going to create a system that is resistant to oligarchy, a functioning democracy is probably the best one. And oligarchy, in my opinion, is an entirely bad thing for multiple reasons. And I don't think Americans who are experiencing oligarchy to some extent at the moment should have any doubt about that. But I have to say that it is the case that, as I think it was, I may have been Jefferson, but some great American either said or is reputed to have said, the price of democracy is perpetual vigilance, that there are always elements within any political system which, if they're left out of control, will seek to take over the system and game it to their own interests. The United States, in its history, has, up to fairly recently, always known how to step in and stop that from happening. So there was, Andrew Jackson, who took on various people, connected with the Bank of the United States, though he was also, by the way, very close to the financiers in New York at that time. But nonetheless, that was an important fact. There were the progressives that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, who pushed all the antitrust actions and who managed to get the Sherman Antitrust Act passed, and who agitated and whose actions led to the Supreme Court case, which resulted in the breakup of Standard Oil, Rockefeller's big oil monopoly. So there's been these pushbacks in the United States in the past. I still hope and want to believe that that will happen in the US again, but it's becoming difficult to believe that. But I would say again, if there's any system that is more proof against oligarchy than any other, I personally believe it is democracy.
All right, from Mark Hewitt, we'll do a couple more super chats and get to the main topic. Mark Hewitt says, would you agree that Joe Manchin seems to have become the most important politician in the U.S.? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. He's the swing figure. I mean, he's in a wonderful position where, whichever side he backs is going to win. So that gives him enormous power. I would say that it's an enormously strong position built on a position of weakness, because he is a Democrat senator for, I think it's West Virginia, which is a strongly red state. So I understand. So his position is actually quite fragile. And that might explain why he swings, from one side to the other, because he has to keep his voters happy by taking, fairly conservative positions on some things. But of course, he can't avoid the fact that he's a Democrat and has loyalties to the Democrats, and that pulls him back in other directions too. But at the moment, undoubtedly, he is an enormously powerful person, with the Senate divided as it is. I mean, if he is opposed to something, it doesn't happen. And if he supports it, it generally does.
Okay, from Toilet Sauce, 2 questions. If the first lockdown worked, why repeat it? Second question, if the first lockdown didn't work, why repeat it?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. I mean, what more can I say?
Yeah. Lukashenko, Belarus. That is the model. All right. Let's see. From Flying Boar, what's going on with the Suez Canal? Will the oil prices go up?
Well, oil prices have been going up and down a little since the beginning of this year, but I think the trend generally is for them to go up. And I think if the great, spending program that Joe Biden has unveiled actually sees its course and, has the effect that he predicts, then I'm sure we will see them going up a lot further. Events like the one in the Suez Canal don't help. And they do give us an insight into what might happen rather more radical things begin to happen. I mean, this ship will presumably eventually be sort of, righted and moved aside, and this blockage will cease. But, if you start getting a conflict in the Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz are blockaded, then, of course, things become a lot more complicated. And if one ship getting, snarled up in the Suez Canal can cause this much chaos, well, think what a conflict in the Gulf might do.
All right, let's take a super chat from Flying Boar, then get into Biden's press conference. Let's get those likes up, everybody, from Flying Boar. And I like this question. I just did a video on this on my channel. I did a video on this morning and then got it on my channel. Trudeau taking shots at Putin after Biden debacle last week. Putin should ignore him. What do you make of Trudeau now going after Putin? Though he did refrain from calling Putin a killer. He did say that Putin is up to all kinds of no good. He called on Putin to release Navalny. He said that these are human rights abuses. But I have to be fair. I've been looking at a lot of videos coming out of Canada. And man, the Trudeau government is pretty strict with what they're doing to people that are breaking Trudeau's rules. So perhaps Trudeau should take a look at what's going on in Canada before he starts lashing out at Putin. Alexander, very quickly, what do you make of Trudeau going after the Russian president?
Well, I mean, it's his master's voice. It's, the poodle following the lead of its master, or if you prefer, the monkey, joining in the song given to it by the organ grinder. So, I mean, you have Biden saying all these horrible things. We see the US and the European Union, weighing in with sanctions. So, of course, Trudeau loyally follows. This was not the way it used to be. I mean, Canada was always, I remember, a force of restraint. It was always a powerful, influential diplomatic force for keeping people talking to each other and keeping things, communications open, and for fostering dialogue. That's not what Trudeau is about. Trudeau is all about posturing, virtue signaling, saying the right things to, that his friends in the neo-globalist and neoliberal community want to hear. They don't like Putin very much. So from his point of view, it's fine. He was going to issue some completely token and entirely meaningless sanctions, which the Russians are just going to completely disregard. They're probably even aware of them. And that's what he's going to do. Now, the thing I'd say about these sanctions is, of course, if you look at the sanctions that Trudeau has imposed and the people he sanctioned, they've already been sanctioned. They've been already sanctioned by the United States. They've already been sanctioned by the European Union. Canada weighing in and adding more sanctions on top of those sanctions isn't going to make any difference to the lives of these people at all. It is purely token. It's symbolism. It's virtue signaling, which actually, ultimately, I think impresses no one except some part of Trudeau's electoral base in Canada. And before I finish on this, it's really striking, and it repeatedly happens now, that one of the people who gets repeatedly targeted for these sanctions by the US, by the European Union, now by Trudeau, is a Russian official called Sergei Kiryenko. Kiryenko is now the deputy chief of the executive office, which is the central secretariat of the Russian government. Once upon a time, not so long ago, way back in the 90s, he was an arch liberal. He was, in fact, Russia's last true liberal prime minister. When Boris Yeltsin sacked him, as I remember, happened in 1998, after the ruble was devalued, the US and the West were furious and hugely upset about it because they considered Kiryenko at that time to be one of their own. And this constant sanctioning of Kiryenko today does make me wonder what this man has done, that they now hate him so much, because he's clearly become one of the number one targets, from being the arch liberal globalist friend of the West in the 1990s. He's now somebody, as I said, that the globalists and the European Union and the US and Canada and Trudeau all sanction. And I wonder, do they feel that he somehow betrayed them, that he's gone over to the other side, and that explains why they're so angry with him and why they come after him in the way they do? And what does he have to do with Navalny? Very weird to me. I mean, I don't understand that at all.
Yeah, if Trudeau understood exactly what Navalny stood for, boy,
Well,
he would be shocked. His woke neoliberal SJW ideology would just be absolutely stunned if he understood exactly what Navalny has said in the past.
Well, I'm going to be a bit more cynical than you, Alex. I think Trudeau knows exactly what Navalny has said and what Navalny stands for and what he talks about. Bear in mind that Amnesty International in Britain, which is an organization which I'm sure Trudeau is very familiar with, and whose opinions he follows closely, well, they have withdrawn from Navalny his prisoner of conscience status when they found out the kind of things he said and stood for. So Trudeau supporting Navalny in the way that he is doing shows, to my mind, how ultimately cynical Trudeau is about the things he says he believes. I mean, he sets himself up to be this great liberal, virtue signaling, progressive champion, but ultimately he is completely cynical about his beliefs, as I suspect he is about everything else. And the way he's conducted himself as Prime Minister of Canada, to my mind, confirms that.
Yeah. I wonder if Navalny was ordered to go back to Russia, because if he was really that worried about all this this prison stuff and all this human rights abuse, why did he get on the plane from Germany to go back to Russia? I bet you he was ordered to go back so that we could have this whole big stink about human rights abuses and Putin once again. That's my feeling on it. I think he was ordered by the globalists to go back. They said, get back to Russia, because we have a narrative, we have a script that we need to run. We have Trudeau, he's already been scripted. We have Biden, he's been scripted. We have Merkel. We've got to run this script. So get on a plane and go back to Russia and play your part.
Well, possibly, but it's still very strange. And I know lots of people in Russia are bewildered by it, because, he had been warned in advance that if he did come to Russia, he would face, a jail term because he breached his parole regulations. So it is odd that he did decide to go there. And if he was ordered to go and didn't want to go, one wonders what kind of pressure he was put under. Lots, I'm sure. But I also have to say this. I think both Navalny and his supporters in the West hugely overestimated the impact in Russia of his return. I mean, I was reading before he went there some really bizarre accounts about, comparing him with Lenin's coming to St. Petrograd in 1917 on the sealed train, and he'd come and there'd be a revolution and the whole Putin system would disintegrate upon his arrival, and that there'd be a great uprising of the people. I mean, if that's what they really thought would happen, then all I can say is both Navalny and his supporters in the West are completely out of touch. And what actually happened was that, the protests fizzled out almost immediately. I mean, there were only about 3 of them, 3 days of them. And when Josep Borrell from the, European Union came along, determined to put the Russians on the spot over Navalny, what he found was that the Russians were in a completely uncompromising mood, and he had to retreat from Moscow with his tail between his legs. So, I mean, whatever the plan was, I mean, it doesn't seem to me like it's worked very well. Bear in mind, by the way, and I say that there may have been a plan and may have been expectations that things would take a different turn. No less a person than ex-CIA chief John Brennan was, fantasizing that, Biden would become president of the US and Navalny would be president of Russia. And he was talking, he was even misquoting John Lennon and Imagine to say, that, this is a wonderful prospect that, that we might have in the future. If they really think like that, then, as I said, they know profoundly little about this country that they're demonizing all the time.
Well, Alexander, let's talk about people not knowing much about the country that that they're currently in, and let's talk about scripts. And that's a great segue into Biden's first press conference, the long-awaited, long-delayed press conference, which was completely scripted, completely stage managed. Actually, we have photos out now where Biden actually does have the script in front of him. He has little pictures of all the journalists. He has little notes. I imagine it was all put in place, a nice list, who to call on, the questions they would ask, how he would answer. The whole thing was completely stage managed, completely scripted, and yet it was still a train wreck. Outside of the normal expected brain freezes and gaffes and mumbles and bumbles, we had Joe Biden, I think, going off script. And I really think he went off script and talked about running in 2024. I don't think he was supposed to say that. We had Biden coming out and saying that he will not allow reporters to the southern border until he fixes things up. We had him saying that he talked to Xi Jinping for 2 hours. He called Xi Jinping. He says he doesn't have a democratic bone in his body. And then he gave the usual stuff about democracy and we can do the right thing and we need unity and all these things. And he also had, at one point, a demented, really strange laugh when he was talking about running again and about Trump. He brought up Trump a lot too, actually. And he said, I miss Trump. He said, we miss Trump. And then he had this really strange kind of spooky, creepy laugh to him. The journalists were pathetic. The questions were softball questions. Everything was scripted. I'm sure he got the questions ahead of time. I'm sure he had the answers in front of him. At one point, he was actually reading the response to North Korea. I mean, he was reading how the U.S. is going to respond to North Korea. He had the script right there, and he was just going line by line, going da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It was unbelievable. And of course, finally, they kept it to 62 minutes. So he went 2 minutes over, but the whole thing was so stage managed. It was ridiculous. The title of this live stream is Ministry of Truth. We are truly living the 1984 nightmare. This is absolutely crazy. What did you make of Biden's first press conference?
Well, I mean, to me, I have to say it was a classic example of somebody coming along and burbling for an hour and actually saying nothing really very much at all. I mean, it was all over the place. It was every bit as incoherent as you said, every bit as scripted and controlled as you said. I mean, we had only 10 journalists who were allowed to answer questions. They were carefully selected. Biden was obviously very carefully briefed as to who he should call. And I'm sure, and obviously, I mean, there was a clear indications in advance of the nature of the questions that would be put to him. And even then, he struggled at times to be coherent. I mean, it was actually quite interesting that, he'd start sort of trying to answer the question. Then he'd sort of flounder off into long digressions. Then the digressions would get ever more complicated and he'd clearly lose his train. And then he'd try and sort of go back in some way, in some disorganized kind of way, to the original question and try to answer it, which he wasn't ever really able to do. But anybody looking to that press conference for a clear insight into what the President of the United States and his administration are going to do with the United States is going to be very disappointed. Now, a few takeaways. First of all, this was very, very much a press conference focused around the Democrats and their agenda and what the Democrats want to do and what they and their plan for the US taking it forward. So it's actually very little about other things, barely anything about economic policy. That was really quite striking and really rather remarkable. An awful lot about immigration, and we got an absolute chaotic fumble there. I mean, I really wasn't able to make out much of what Biden was saying, but he seemed to be saying that things are no worse than they were under Donald Trump, which, I mean, straightforwardly just isn't true. But, you know, as you, by the way, also correctly said, he clearly has Donald Trump a lot on the brain. I mean, he was coming up with Donald Trump all the time. It was very weird. Then there was a bit about China, but not really ultimately very much. A very softball question about North Korea. There were groveling questions from the questioners, including one which bizarrely referred to Biden as being a moral and decent person, and that this is why people were coming to the US and, you know, wanting to, you know, cross the border, and this is all down to Biden's decency and morality. Even he seemed to find that a bit much, by the way. And, you know, on so many other things, there wasn't anything. I mean, there was nothing about the situation in Syria, nothing about the situation in Iran, really. No real discussion about Russia. I think Russia got mentioned once, Putin got mentioned once, but nothing very much of substance said about that. A long discursive piece about China and how China supposedly is all about autocracy and how well he knows Xi Jinping and how well he got on with Xi Jinping and how well they understand each other. Actually, rather emollient words, I thought, overall about China, but all very, very incoherent. A long tirade, and again, a very incoherent tirade about the filibuster. I mean, that seemed to take up an enormous amount of time, an issue which I doubt, by the way, that many Americans are really very, you know, understand or are concerned about very much. It's an important issue, but nonetheless, not, I think, one that is, you know, of immediate relevance to people. And then very strange things. I mean, you know, he says on the one hand that it's a relic of the old racialist times in the United States. But then he's asked, well, are you going to do away with it then? Well, he didn't really say. He didn't come up with any kind of answer. And he comes up with this very strange thing about, you know, that it's Jim Crow, going from Jim Crow to Jim Eagle. I mean, even I don't understand what that means. I mean, presumably, you know, an eagle is a sort of superior bird to a crow. But
that's exactly what it means.
Well,
that was the purpose of it, yeah.
I know, but you know, what was the point that was actually being made? I mean, I completely.
An eagle is bigger than a crow.
Crow, exactly. But as I said, I mean, what exactly the point was? I mean, I just what was the meaning of it? And then he says, you know, that he joined the Senate 120 years ago. I mean, I presume that was a joke, but perhaps his own sense of time is now beginning to get a bit shaky. Maybe it feels to him like 120 years. I mean, really, I thought it was very weird. And then the way it ended, you know, suddenly, you know, as we say, you know, as actors like to say, in media res, you know, right in the middle of it, you know, where it all seemed to be getting started, he suddenly announces, "That's all, folks," and just walks off. Yeah. It's all very strange. Exactly. I mean, it was all weird. I mean, it was like he just suddenly, it was like you know, you listen to a sort of one of those old LPs and it suddenly stops. It's just all very strange. So, I mean, it was, shall we say, a uninspiring performance. I think that's been very, very generous. I mean, others have been far less generous. I mean, you called it a train wreck or a car crash. National Review called it disgraceful. Others have said, you know, it's empty. And I mean, I read a piece by Scott Ritter, which I thought, you know, explained how empty it was. But to be truthful, I mean, what does one expect from Joe Biden at this time? I mean, he's clearly not the person who's fully in charge. At least that's not how he seems to me. So expecting anything more from a news conference like this is expecting rather a lot. And people seem to be treating it as a great achievement that he actually got through the news conference without making too many fluffs and boobs and mistakes. And so, I mean, I thought he made quite a few. I mean, any other president who acted like that through a news conference, I mean, they'd have taken him to pieces. But because he's Joe Biden, it's all treated as a great success because, well, he didn't forget the fact that he was in the White House, or things of that kind, that he was able to answer questions, even if he did so in this very strange and very chaotic and muddled and confused and incoherent way. But anyway, I mean, priorities of the Democrats, clearly immigration, where they seem to be giving no ground at all, as far as I could see, and clearly getting rid of the filibuster. I mean, Biden skated over that one, but clearly that is part of the agenda now. I mean, they're very, very focused on doing away with the filibuster as soon as they can. And clearly that was a question that was put up to him. And he was asked to give some red meat on China, but didn't. He was asked to say some interesting things about North Korea, and didn't. And he said an awful lot about Donald Trump, who's still fixated about. And he actually said quite a lot about Barack Obama also, who's clearly his mentor and the person who, so one feels. So one feels. So that, in summary, was my view of it. I mean, an extraordinarily uninspiring event, but one which I found completely unsurprising and precisely as one might have expected. We're not going to see more press conferences from Joe Biden. I think this is the best it gets. I think from now on, they'll be even more careful after this event to make it even less likely that he'll be caught out with questions, with more questions in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole takeaway from all of this was his communications team and his handlers are just absolutely happy that he got through it. I mean, they're just like, we got it out of the way. Yeah. Now they won't bother us about another press conference for another 6 months. We won't have to put Biden up to anything for another 6 months, and we can just kind of skate along with our policy, which I think you're exactly right. It's getting rid of the filibuster, immigration, which is going to be big. And I think that their plan is to just get as many people in country as they possibly can. And I think for foreign policy, I got the impression that Biden's just not going to deal with it, and it's been outsourced to, I guess, Blinken, Susan Rice. I don't know. I mean, if I was a world leader, I would kind of be scratching my head saying, who exactly do I contact when I need something done or I need to talk to somebody? I mean, who do I reach? Because the impression that I got was that Biden's just not going to handle anything that's foreign policy related.
Absolutely. Well, there was hardly anything on foreign policy at all. There was this long, as I said, philosophical, well, pseudo-philosophical discourse about China, and which seemed to be more, by the way, it struck me, an attempt to contain any damage politically that the Democrats might suffer about China. I mean, saying, for example, that China wouldn't overtake the US on Joe Biden's watch, which, by the way, might be construed by some people as, in effect, saying that China is going to overtake the US. Just isn't going to happen.
That's how I read it. Exactly. I mean, when a politician says something like that, I'll give you another example. I don't want to cut you off, but you read my mind. When a politician says something like that, it usually means the exact opposite, i.e. China is going to overtake us on my watch. And the other thing, when a politician says, going to your point, when a politician says, we're going to get out of Afghanistan, but not by May 1st. But eventually we will. To me, I just read that as we're never leaving Afghanistan.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's exactly that. By the way, I agree with that completely. I mean, we're never going to leave Afghanistan because he's got no plan or project or ideas about how to do it. And of course, there's a massive, massive pressure from within the US bureaucracy and the Pentagon and Congress, from the hardliners in Congress and the neocons in the administration, to keep the troops there indefinitely. So that's what will happen. Wars, the forever wars, which Biden once upon a time, long ago, was it, last year or even the year before that, said he would end. They're going to go on just as they always have, just as they always did in Obama's day, just as they did in previous administrations. He's not going to end them. He doesn't know how to end them, and he doesn't have the political strength to end them, or even the understanding of the need to end them. So it's just drift. It's complete, total, and absolute drift, with a hole in the middle where the president should be, an empty space.
So my question is serious. Who does Boris Johnson talk to when he calls the White House? Who does Xi talk to when he calls the White House? Who does Erdogan talk to when he calls the White House? Bolsonaro, Modi, anyone? Who do they talk to? Who do you think is running the show there for foreign policy?
Well, you see, this is the extremely.
This is a serious question, by the way.
Very, very serious, very, very serious question, because of course everybody needs to know who is in charge in the United States. The United States is still the world's most powerful country. It is still the world's pivotal country. It will remain the world's pivotal country, even if China does overtake it in overall power, because the US, unlike China, stands at the center of a whole complex network of trade links and military and political alliances, and at the center of the financial system, just as Britain remained for a very long time after the US overtook it, the key country. The US will remain the key country for a long time to come. And so people want to know who is in charge in Washington. And what the administration is trying to tell them is, yes, it is still Joe Biden. I mean, just before we did this program, we shared a link with each other which shows that Joe Biden actually attended a meeting of the European Council. That's the major policy-making decision body of the European Union. Joe Biden, who's president of the United States, which is not a member of the European Union, actually attended a meeting of the European Council.
A Zoom. A
virtual meeting, exactly. But I mean, that is really quite remarkable and very extraordinary and very unexplained and very not discussed. But obviously one purpose of that, which we'll come to that meeting later, one purpose of that, again, is to project the appearance that he is the president, he is the person in charge. I think more and more people around the world are going to question that. And that leaves them with the big question, whom do we talk to? Well, several people have been talking to Kamala Harris, who's clearly being prepared as the person who's going to take over. And I think more and more people will want to talk to Kamala Harris. But the problem is, Kamala Harris isn't impressive, and that's putting it mildly, and she doesn't have the full support of the bureaucracy. People like General Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon clearly aren't really happy to take orders from her. The other person is Blinken, but Blinken isn't impressive either. We saw how the Chinese just steamrolled over him at the Anchorage summit. And I mean, he doesn't come across as a strong and effective figure either. And I think world leaders looking at this will say to themselves, well, we can't really talk to Biden because, Biden isn't obviously in full control, but we can't really talk to Kamala Harris either. And we don't really know whether we should be talking to Blinken at all. So what are we going to do in this situation? Well, despite the United States having the central position that I said, they will say to themselves, since we can't talk to the United States, we have no real choice but to do something else, which is to talk to each other and to bypass the United States. Because if we do go to the United States, we don't get any answers. And at that point, that system of alliances, of political and trade contacts, that web that has been created, spun around the United States over the decades, that will start to unravel, and will begin to unravel even faster than it would otherwise do.
Interesting. All right. Let's do some more super chats, Alexander. Then we'll get to some calls, and I'll put the link in about 2-3 minutes. I'll put the link up for the call in. Remember to use Chrome, Firefox, Brave, which is the best browser. The call in does not take Safari. So just about every other browser, Opera, it works outside of Safari. You should be okay. Make sure you have a good set of headphones and a good mic on those headphones, or if you have a standalone mic, even better. And we'll get some calls in, Alexander, and let's just do a couple of super chats because you're talking about China. And Flying Boar wants to know, the EU sanctioned China and then China retaliated and the EU went all nuts. Will it affect China economically?
No, it won't. It won't affect China economically. And in fact, I've read some fascinating commentaries about all of this in the Chinese media, in one of which said that the EU sanctioning China and trying to undermine China economically would be for the EU suicidal. I mean, that's what the Chinese think. The Chinese are very confident that they are now strong enough economically to ride out any conceivable sanctions. They also, and this is a point which I can't emphasize too strongly, I've discussed this in programs in my own channel, but the Chinese also feel that this big deal that they've done with Russia actually secures them in not just geostrategically, but in that essential sense of securing their access to the natural resources they need to develop their economy. That makes them less dependent on foreign trade because they don't need foreign exchange in order to buy the kind of food imports and oil and gas imports and strategic minerals and strategic chemicals and things of that they've had to buy in order to keep the machines and the factories in China whirring. So from the Chinese point of view, it's the EU that needs China much more than China needs the EU. By the way, I think anybody looking at the respective strengths of the two economies would agree. So for the European Union to come along and start slapping sanctions on China is not going to materially affect the Chinese in any way. It's only going to provoke them. And China is absolutely not in a mood to take that kind of slap in the face from the Europeans any longer, given the history of European interactions with the Chinese in the colonial era. And the Chinese are pushing back, and they're pushing back very strongly, and they're very angry, and they retaliated, of course, exactly as we've just heard. And of course, the Europeans don't like it, just as they didn't like it when Josep Borrell went to Moscow and was, lectured, found himself on the receiving end of tough questions and tough comments from Lavrov and from the Russian media at a press conference. The European Union acts all the time as if people should sit quietly, listen to whatever lectures they hand out, be it to the Chinese, be it to the Russians, be it to anyone else. And when that is done back to them in return, they're shocked and furious and just can't handle it. And by the way, if you're talking about Tony Blinken, there's exactly the same thing happened when he came up against the Chinese at Anchorage. He thought that he could recite, all the usual talking points the West has against China, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, whatever. And he just was completely taken aback when the Chinese delegates came back and lectured him in return and to his face. It was actually really interesting to watch the pictures of that event. So that's where we are. I think the Chinese are not prepared to accept lectures. The European Union is acting foolishly recklessly. If the European Union and the West have serious issues with China, which I can see that they might do, then what they need to do is to take strong policies and make strong decisions, not think that they can provoke the Chinese by token symbolic sanctions, and at the same time get angry when the Chinese retaliate, and at the same time do massive trade deals with Beijing and with China, as they just have done. I mean, it just doesn't make any kind of sense at all.
Absolutely crazy. The EU is now going to go after China. They go after Russia. Now they're going to go after China, and then they're going to expect to strike all these deals. The EU is just they're freaking out of their minds. Freaking out of their minds.
Well, absolutely.
These guys have no idea what the hell they're doing, or they're getting the wrong orders. Maybe they do know what they're doing, but they're just getting the wrong orders, and they have no autonomy in their decision making whatsoever. They're definitely not looking after the best interests of European citizens, to say the least. These guys they're just so out of touch. And anyway, it just drives me crazy, these guys. Anyway, from Jang Hyuk, $4 super sticker. Thank you for that. And we have a new member to the Duran community, Elaine. Elaine is a new member. Welcome, Elaine. And we'll do some more super chats in a little bit, but let's do a couple of calls, Alexander. Let's bring in Zariel to the stream. Zariel, you are up. Hello, Zariel. Are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
How you doing?
Absolutely.
Good afternoon. Got some good news and some bad news. This is a very, very recent news from Germany. They have officially announced that they are now going to introduce the digital vaccination ID in Germany by using the first city in Germany as their prototype or their pilot project, Altötting. So it is official. It was announced this afternoon in the news. However, there is some good news on the horizon. The law firm or the lawyers that I was telling you about last week, they have actually spoken about some class action lawsuits in Canada and also in Germany using the Nuremberg Code, which I'm sure Alexander is very familiar with. Because it is testing on living human beings, which is absolutely forbidden by the Nuremberg Code. So we have a little light on the horizon, maybe. I just thought I'd let you guys know about this.
That is fascinating, and thank you very much for that information. I have to say, the first part of it, I had already known would come. I mean, it was the whole direction of travel was in that direction. The lawsuits are some things we need to follow very closely indeed, because I would talk at the introduction of this program about this decision, for example, that happened in Craig Murray's case in Scotland, and it was worrying there to me how the protections, freedom of speech protections, it seems to me, were being ignored by a court in Scotland, or at least not ignored, at least they weren't being given the proper respect that they should have been. And I wonder, and I hope that future claims under the Nuremberg principles will indeed be effective. Nuremberg principles are the absolute bedrock of international law and international human rights law. I mean, if you really want to understand that kind of law, you have to go back to Nuremberg. And I will say it will be extremely difficult intellectually and philosophically for courts around the world to go against those kind of principles if they are expressed in that way. Do you happen to know these class actions, are they being brought on behalf of German citizens?
I'm sorry, as far as I've heard, that it is in Canada, if I correctly heard.
Canada, yeah.
It was Canada.
I see.
America. The lawsuits that are happening in Germany right now are on behalf of children, because there's a special law over here that protects children with child custody. The state can't take over. So this is the rail that they're actually running along to, and from there they will be able to use precedents.
That'd be very interesting because, of course, Germany has a particular interest in this area for obvious reasons, which I don't need to go into.
Of course.
What will happen in Canada and the United States, we shall see. Now, of course, the people who played the leading role in formulating the Nuremberg principles were the American lawyers who participated in those cases. If you want to actually read the judgments and the comments of people like Joseph Jackson, who was the prosecutor in that case, who's a former member of the Supreme Court of the United States, by the way, then they are universally seen as the gold standard. And we will see what happens, whether American courts especially are prepared to follow that line of jurisprudence, or whether they'll try and edge and find their ways around it. So that's extraordinarily interesting, Zariel. Thank you very much for that information. I'm very interested to hear that. I'd be very interested to know how these cases evolve.
I will be following up on this and try to get to you guys next week.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zariel.
Have a great weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Let's bring in Google Whistleblower. Then we'll do some Discord. We'll take actually calls from Tarif, Bomeo, and Alex. Then we'll do some Discord and some super chats. We have our Discord link pinned to the top of the live stream as well. So we got some good action on the Discord server. A lot of people are talking as well. Here is Tarif. Tarif, how you doing?
How y'all doing, gentlemen? Thanks for taking our call.
Doing great. How are you doing?
It's a blessing that y'all keep up the good work and talk about geopolitics, because that's what the world needs right now to live in harmony. Okay, I was reading that ship container thing that went cocked sideways, which y'all put on y'all site yesterday. I looked at the video and how that guy broke it down made sense. You know, United States don't really have, our manufacturing been shipped to China, so it will affect us with those limited cargo freights already. And what the guy was saying in the video, and by that ship being cocked sideways, that's gonna have a ripple effect to the market. You're gonna see the price of different things go up, because he was saying certain machinery need plastic plugs. To put milk in jugs which made of plastic, you need the resin for that, to make the molds from those resins. So then on top of that, you got the stimulus coming out, which is needed, but at the same time, it's not being spent wisely on infrastructure. So the hyperinflation, then you got the coming shortage on certain materials from the cargo ships. So we're in a terrible situation, and we're gonna face that in the next 6 months to a year, and people gonna wonder where it's coming from, and they're gonna blame Trump as usual. But also my last comment, of course, I want to say free Julian Assange. Of course, I gotta say that. My last comment, infrastructure. I'm not hearing anything about infrastructure unless they're talking about the Green New Deal infrastructure, which is BS. Why is it BS? I watch real scientists that say CO2 is actually good for the planet. Real scientists that say nuclear power is actually, is the best thing for the planet. What you need. Nothing wrong with having coal plants. Nothing wrong with having natural gas plants. Because anytime you have a large city and you have manufacturing industries, you need that energy output to go to those factories. I should know this. I used to work in the hospital field. The hospital I worked at, our energy bills alone was $1 million a month. So just imagine if we go to windmills and solar power. They're only good when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. Okay, then when it's cold and those windmills spinning, because if the sun is not out and it's overcast, the solar panels not going to be producing energy. So when it's cold, even though the wind is blowing, those those windmills revert some of the energy that they make it to themselves, so they won't freeze up. That's the ones that's winterized. And also is based on the nature. So it's not really that well. So the best thing is nuclear power. Louisiana joined a lawsuit against a Biden administration signing those EOs to stop pollutants, to stop the carbon pollutants and stuff like that. And they had to, because our state depends on oil and gas. It does. And a lot of people be out of work. Because when I was growing up in Louisiana, you had different options to work at post office, become a police officer, join the military, work offshore on a petroleum platform, or work at the docks. That's what that was your 5 options in Louisiana, unless you become a barber or cut people grass, or become a waiter in the hospitality, to become a service, take part of the service industry in New Orleans, which is big. So that was your 7 options in the city. So if you're gonna cut down petroleum, output or whatever, because you're joining a French what you call a climate thing, thing again, that's gonna hurt jobs, man. People will be laid off, and you're really gonna see people hurting. So I mean, I would like to say one more thing. They have this guy named Doctor. Let me see. I gotta pull it up on my screen. What is that? It went blank, but there you go. Okay, Dr. William Harper. He talks about how to think about global warming, which is a natural occurrence. The Earth been going through this since we had an atmosphere and water on the planet. It been changing. So he talks about, his name is Dr. William Harper. He's a scientist. He got some patents behind his name too. So he's a reputable type of person. He's not a nut. So I mean, maybe one day y'all can check him out, and maybe I can put the link in y'all description somewhere. And the people that's listening to this program can go check him out as he talked with Richard Freeman from EIR. So yeah, gentlemen, thank you for taking our calls. Thank you for taking my calls, and thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Tarif. Real quick before you jump in, Alexander, when you guys put up links on the YouTube comments, sometimes YouTube blocks those links out. So just an FYI, we have no control over that. But what you can do is go to the Discord server, and you can put all the links on Discord as well, and we could get those links and try to share them out on the website. So that's just an FYI when you're putting links in the comments section. So Alexander, you said the economy will go through a 6% boom. Actually, I think Biden might have even mentioned that during the press conference, 6%. I think he threw that number out there. But it looks like, listening to Tarif and to everything that's going on, whether it's what's going on in the Suez, which is definitely unbelievable, and what looks like is going to happen in the United States with the 1.9 trillion stimulus. We hear that another 3 trillion may be on the way as well. And a lot of money printing, a lot of burr is going to be coming into the system. Things are not looking good. What's your take on this? There's a big topic.
Well, it's a huge topic. And first of all, can I just say, I mean, the way to understand this is that everything is connected. So let's start with our container ship and the points that Tarif was making about the way in which manufacturing capacity in the United States and in other economies has been run down. And he's absolutely right, by the way. I mean, one of the things that globalization, which has taken the concept, Adam Smith's idea of the international division of labor, to an incredible extreme, far beyond anything that Adam Smith would have anticipated when he wrote The Wealth of Nations back in the 18th century. What that has done is that it has left particular nodes of the economy extremely vulnerable. So one of the things we've discovered in Britain, for example, recently, is that that we are very dependent for this medication program that the British government has been unrolling over the last few months on imports from India and from the EU, because we don't produce that to the extent that we need to ourselves. And going back to what Tarif was saying, it's the same with a manufacturing capacity in the United States. So if you are going to do what the Biden administration is doing, which is add massively stimulus on top of an already growing economy, increase demand even more at a time when international supply chains are overstretched and your own manufacturing capacity cannot meet that demand, you are going to create great tensions, great degree of overheating within your economy. And the classical way that expresses itself is through inflation. Now, when there's going to be problems supplying goods to the United States, because this huge surge in demand is going to suck in these goods, it's not only going to create more inflation, it's also going to increase trade and budget deficits even further, which may create further problems down the line and might start to put pressure eventually on the dollar. So all kinds of things start to happen, and they become interconnected. And on this infrastructure plan, which we are hearing so much about now, there are infrastructure plans, and there are infrastructure plans. When Eisenhower was building, the interstate highways in the 1950s, that was an infrastructure plan. That was a plan looked at the in bottlenecks in the economy. It sought to solve them by building these great roads, and in fact, doing that strengthen the economy going forward. But if what you're actually calling an infrastructure plan is not actually an infrastructure plan in reality, but a Green Deal type plan. In other words, you're trying to do green things and invest in green technologies and green industries and all sorts of green things like that. By stealth, calling it an infrastructure plan, but it's not debated and discussed properly. What you risk doing is you risk a massive misallocation of resources, of investment and money going into all sorts of things which might not work out properly, but which might cause even more pressure on your underlying economy. It might overheat it even further. It might draw in even more imports. And at the same time, you're going to make it more difficult to resolve the issues of demand in your economy, which you are creating because the bottlenecks that exist are not being addressed. And of course, if you are conducting an infrastructure plan like that, which is not really an infrastructure plan, but a Green Deal, if you like, then the other risk you run is that you're not adding to employment, which is partly what infrastructure plans are intended to do. You are in fact sloshing in more money into an economy, as I said, misallocating resources with the high prospect that some of the resources, some of that money will drain upwards, will go to those people who already have huge amounts, and that inequality will thereby increase. A well-run, well-conceived infrastructure plan, like Eisenhower's in the 50s, tends to do the opposite. This one might, on the contrary, lead to more inequality rather than less. So it's all very half-baked, very ill thought through. It looks to me like a great jumble of talking points from what calls itself the progressive movement. You give them green deals, you try to get it, past Congress by calling it an infrastructure plan. You provide huge amounts of money to the economy. You say it's a pandemic relief package, even though, in fact, when you unpack it, most of it isn't for pandemic relief. You do all of these things, and what you can end up with is an economy that is ultimately weaker, more unbalanced. Money, resources have been misallocated even further. Inflation is higher, prices are higher, unemployment perhaps is structurally greater, debt is much greater, and inequality is even greater than it otherwise might have been. So these things need to be thought through if they're to be done properly. And I don't get the impression that there's any thinking behind this whatsoever.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, Tarif, thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah, you have a
Thank-
follow-up or?
Yeah, a follow up. Okay, Jackson, Mississippi. I found out pipes was bust when that freeze happened. All right, so real infrastructure would be changing their pipes, Flint pipes, Newark, New Jersey pipes, and other cities pipes. They got 125,000 people still out of water in different parts of Houston, Texas, and also in Jackson, Mississippi, as the whole. And also the last thing. Oh wait, excuse me. When I put my link in y'all Discord, what section in the Discord? Because you know they got different packs.
You can either put it in the live stream chat or the general.
Either of those. Okay.
Yeah. You can put it in, and just about any topic. We've got a conversation going on in all the topics.
Oh, okay.
So we'll get to it. Well, if you put it in the live stream chat, we'll definitely have it there.
All right, I'm gonna do that then. I appreciate that, gentlemen. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tarif.
Just to round off, you see, what you were talking about pipes, sorting out pipes, that is proper infrastructure spending. That is resolving bottlenecks. That's a bottleneck that is restricting the economy. So you put money, you sort that out, you can do that well. You have the if you have the engineers, the technicians, those sort of people to do that. In fairness, there's a lot about the way the Chinese run their economy, which I think is absolutely not appropriate for the rest of the world, and certainly not for the United States to try to copy. But the one thing the Chinese do understand is that they constantly have this cyclical approach to infrastructure. Every so often, every couple of years, they look at where the bottlenecks in the economy are, and they work on sorting them. And that's something, it seems to me, that the United States might learn from. Many other things the Chinese do, I think, are completely wrong for the United States. They wouldn't work there. But that is one which I think tends to work.
All right. Thank you, Tarif.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring in Bomeo. Up next, we got Bomeo, Alex, Anatoly, and Ferdy. Bomeo, I'm bringing you into the stream. Bomeo, you hear us? You with us?
Yes, I can hear you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Alex, for your information, I'll become a member very soon.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Bomeo. How are you doing today? What's your question or comment?
I'm doing very well. I have a question. If you hear quite recently a lot about a rule-based order. However, if you read literatures of a few years back, the common denominator between for relationship between nations was international law. So my question is there anything like a rule-based order in international law? That's my first question. My second question is, if there is, then what is the difference between rule-based order and international law?
Bomeo, you've asked a brilliant question, and it's one of the fundamental issues that is creating geopolitical conflict in the world today. Because if you read Chinese and Russian commentaries, the Russians were ahead of the Chinese on this, but now the Chinese are making the same talking points. What the Russians especially have said is that the rule-based order is an attempt to do away with international law, to substitute a set of rules which some countries, principally the United States, but also to some extent Britain, to a lesser extent France, impose on all the others in a way that extinguishes international law, which is something which has developed organically and which is also strongly anchored in the United Nations and in the United Nations Charter, and which has been developed through courts and precedents, international courts and precedents like that of the International Court of Justice. So the Russians, and as I said, the Chinese are now talking in the same way, see the rule-based order that some people in the West talk about as an attempt to extinguish international law as it has existed and to replace it with something entirely different. They see it as a vehicle for US dominance, because the rule-based order are rules which the US imposes and decides for itself and is the sole and exclusive arbiter of. And they also see it, and the Russians incidentally are now becoming quite outspoken about this, as the major mechanism for achieving globalization, which the Russians see, and as I said, the Chinese are starting to edge ever slowly towards adopting also. The Russians see globalization as a mechanism for certain people in the West to try to enforce their ideas, their trade patterns, their lifestyle patterns, if you like, their general ideas upon everybody else. So what the Russians would say, and I'm not just talking about Russian officials, I'm talking about Russian jurists, Russian lawyers, people of that sort, is that the rule-based order is not only a system that is contrary to international law, it is anti-law. It is actually the opposite of international law. It seeks to overturn international law and substitute to it something which isn't law at all, because the essence of law, including international law, is that it acts as a restraint on everybody, including those who create it. The rule-based order, as it is called, is not something that acts, that those who create it, the United States and their allies in Britain and France, see as placing any restraints upon themselves at all. In fact, they resist the idea that they should be subjected to restraints. The idea of law without restraint is an abomination. Any lawyer who thinks about these things would tell you that. And it's not law, it is anti-law. So that's a somewhat philosophical answer to your question, but I hope I have explained it. It is a major issue. It's a major dividing line. And it's very interesting when you read Western commentaries that talk about the violations of the rule-based international order. You notice that they never refer to international law as such, because that is not what they are actually upholding. The rule-based international order, far from being based on international law, is in effect a rejection of it. Have I answered this clearly? I hope I haven't been confusing and have explained these things properly.
No, you have, because I think if you were listening to comments that are made over the past few years, mostly from Western leaders, you were starting to get confused where the role of international law is. And you were only hearing about the international community, the rule-based international order, and some other new terms that do come up. So I think you have educated me on the question that I had. I was getting a bit confused, but I think it's clear now.
Mm-hmm.
And second to what Tarif was saying, I think Another country that does infrastructure very well is the Netherlands. They are very good at it. Yeah.
Absolutely, and they've had a very long tradition of it, because of course the Netherlands, to a great extent, not entirely, but to a great extent, exists because of its infrastructure. If it didn't have it, a lot of it would be under the sea. So the Dutch have to be good at this, and by the way they are. And the Dutch are very, very good at not just at infrastructure, but all the things that being good at infrastructure causes you to be. I mean, they're careful in the way they invest things. They are very prudent in their handling of money, and of course they have, and these are all linked, an exceptionally advanced and very, very skilled and good machine building industry.
Yes, we are very happy in the Netherlands.
Very good artists as well.
Yeah.
Traditionally great artists.
Nice weekend.
All right, take care, Bobio. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring in Alex, Anatoly, and Ferdy. Alex, you're up. Alex,
Yes,
are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear
Alex.
me?
Yes, we
Clearly.
can. Three Alexes in the stream. All right.
Yeah, it was written in the stars, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, so my question is about big tech and the public utility model. And recently I've been reading about this individual by the name Louis Brandeis, who was this progressive lawyer from the New Deal era. And he was a proponent for curbing corporate power when it comes to the public goods and critical infrastructure. So he designated three aspects how you can limit corporate power in the public domain, and that is through antitrust, corporate governance, and finally the public utility model. Now, and he was Brandeis liked antitrust a lot, and he thought that antitrust was a requirement not just for healthy and competitive markets, but it was a gateway to liberty, no less. So, and my question is, basically reading what they thought about in that progressive era in the 30s, and seeing what we have today with big tech and their chaotic power, which isn't really controlled that much. I just thought that his description of control of corporate power was spot on when it comes to the new era, because if you think about it, corporate power in the public sphere, it's a very complex situation, perhaps, where you cannot just apply the public utility model, and perhaps where antitrust would also be too shallow. So these three aspects show how really difficult it is to control, especially when companies were allowed to grow as big as Facebook is today. And moreover, 100 years ago, people were having the same discussion regarding railroads, for example, and telegraphs. And they were unsure whether to, in the United States at the very least, and they were unsure whether to classify them as public goods or not. So here we are 100 years later, and we're having this conversation again. So I personally think that we have reached a boiling point as society that we should be ready, because there's a lot of criticism and vitriol coming from both sides of the fence. The proponents of free speech and the proponents of censorship are both pushing platforms to act. So, my question is basically, what do you think about this?
Well,
Alexander, before you jump in, I just want to also make a note that we had big tech testify to Congress again yesterday. Actually, it wasn't very much reported, but you did have Dorsey, Pichai from Google, and Zuckerberg. They actually testified in Congress again yesterday. Not much came out of it, but anyway, just a footnote there, Alexander.
Now, I presume, by the way, thank you very much. Very interesting points. Now, I presume you're referring to Louis Brandeis, who was, an associate justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes, correct. Yeah,
and
from 1916 to 39. Yes,
and is in fact one of the great titans of American jurisprudence. I mean, he is a colossal figure, very, very much on the progressive wing of the legal establishment, somebody who the originalist tradition that is prevails today would probably not agree with on many points, but as you absolutely correctly say, a passionate supporter of antitrust and an enemy, as he said, of bigness, which he saw as profoundly anti-democratic. And that was his point. I mean, he was many things. He's a supporter of the New Deal. He had what you might call a sort of interventionist view on law and on developing the constitution, which is somewhat out of fashion nowadays. But he was somebody who was, to go back to some of the earlier points that we had in the earlier discussions, a committed opponent of oligarchy, business oligarchy, monopoly, all of those things, which he saw not just as threatening the economic vitality of the United States, but as threatening to democracy itself, because he saw oligarchy and bigness, as he would put it, as somehow hostile to these things. So you're absolutely right. We have these recurring things, and the United States is at the center of it, and Louis Brandeis is in fact a classical example of this, how in the United States we have these systems where massive power gets accumulated, people abuse that power, they act against freedom of speech, they try to control speech, and the democratic antibodies, if you like, within the political system of the United States have up to now successfully asserted themselves and have acted as a correction. And Brandeis is just one example and just one person who to some extent embodies this. Unfortunately, and I have to say this, there doesn't seem to be anyone like that around today. There is no legal colossus like Brandeis was in his time. I mean, I say that because, even if I don't always agree with his way of looking at things, even when I don't agree with him, I find him remarkable and somebody I learn things from. The people on the Supreme Court today, by comparison, look like minor, mediocre figures. And that is the thing that really concerns me and which baffles me about today. But fundamentally, coming back to your concerns, I think you're absolutely right. When power is concentrated, information power, control of information is controlled in the way that it is today. If businesses, which are not even really businesses anymore, because monopolies, you can argue to what extent they're really businesses, are controlled to the extent that they are. When you have structural systems that exist like we have now, it's not just efficiency in the economy that starts to suffer, which I believe it does, because vitality starts to ebb out of the system, but the whole system of democratic control that starts to ebb away. And that does make one wonder whether some of these ideas that we used before to critique these concentrations and to argue that maybe they are not sustainable, whether some of these critiques that used to exist and which people took comfort from, whether they're actually valid any longer when you see the enormous structures that exist today. But, I'm glad you brought him up, because he's actually somebody who has many lessons we could learn from now.
Yes, The Curse of Bigness, I believe, was the name.
So Alex, if I could ask you a question, where do you stand on the platform issue, the antitrust? How would you like to deal with big tech monopolies, if you want to give your opinion?
Is it a question for me? Sorry.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the thing is, I'm writing my master's thesis right now on something similar, and I am I'm not sure really. I don't know if you've heard, but there is a proposal in the EU which is called Digital Service Package, which is divided into the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act, and that is the center of my research right now. And this is the first sort of global effort. Well, not globally, it's an EU effort, but it's the first effort in in the world right now to finally put the big tech under some control, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not it's going to work or not. It's not planned to be passed until 2023, so there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of things to be analyzed. And I'm sure you're aware that the big tech have let their lobbyists loose in their Brussels office on the lawmakers, basically. And it's actually how the lobbying is done is really interesting as well, because it's an incredibly opaque process, and we don't know. In most cases, we don't even know who lobbies for whom, because it's so secret. And people who make their points, they're not allowed to say that they're working for Apple or for Facebook and the big tech sector. And the people who are in charge of creating policy, let's say, they are very evasive. I tried to talk to some people. They never say that, well, we know what the big tech wants from their lobbying efforts. So in short, I don't know, but hopefully I'll find out closer to May when I'm scheduled to graduate.
Awesome.
Well,
Alexander,
go on.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question, Alexander, going off of what Alex said. Is it fair to say that when the big difference between the EU and the US when dealing with big tech is that when the EU proposes to enact legislation to curb big tech's power, they want to enact that legislation, but they want to move the moderation and the control of free speech to the center, to the state. In other words, if Germany was to take action against Facebook, they may take action, but they eventually want to be the ones that control the speech that is coming out of Germany. In other words, they want to move it to the government. Where in the US, traditionally, constitutionally in the US, you would say that the US would monitor free speech and would monitor big tech in order to move free speech back to the people. In other words, back on the back of the Constitution. Is that the main differences between the two systems?
It's a fundamental. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a fundamentally different philosophy. I mean, what you said, by the way, about what the EU wants to do. Well, Angela Merkel has said that. I mean, she says, that what Twitter and Facebook and all these people are doing is wrong. What makes it wrong is that they are doing it. It might be right if we, that is to say, the governments do it, if we do it through legislation. Now, I mean, you can argue that, that does actually open more routes, because, of course, if you have legislation, then that legislation might allow for exceptions, and there might be court systems and legal remedies, which if private companies exercise that kind of power, wouldn't exist. But ultimately, the EU does prefer to control things. It just prefers that it should do it rather than have private companies, especially, dare I say, American private companies, do it instead. So that's what the EU is about. Whereas, as you also correctly say, the American tradition has been to break up monopolies, to have as few restrictions on government interference as possible, and the American concept of democracy is that there's an open space. Things get worked out there in the open. Government shouldn't interfere too much. Private business should certainly not interfere too much. And eventually you will get the optimal solution through the conflict of ideas. That's the ideal anyway. Now, I just want to finish with one point, which is that, of course, Louis Brandeis, who we were talking about, was, as I said, very much a Roosevelt progressive. He was very much somebody who was on the side of Roosevelt. And he was also a supporter of antitrust. You're absolutely right, Alex. He talked about it's the curse of bigness. That's what he used to say. Contrast that with the stance people who call themselves progressives take today. So many of them take exactly the diametrically opposite view of what Brandeis argued for in the 30s when he was an associate justice at the Supreme Court. They want to see bigness. They want to see monopolies do these sort of things, big tech do these sort of things. We should not overlook the extraordinary extent to which, philosophically, people who call themselves progressives have gone completely back on the ideas that progressives themselves used to stand for. Brandeis, if he could be brought back today through some kind of time machine and were to see, the big tech companies today, he would be horrified. Of that, I have no doubt. And he would say that the curse of bigness, has got completely out of hand. And he would be incredulous that there are so many people who call themselves progressive who seem not to understand that.
All right, Alex, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Take care. All right, let's bring in Anatoly. Anatoly, are you ready? Anatoly, you're on the stream. How are you doing?
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, very well. Very well.
Pleasure to talk to you. First of all, let me thank you for all your wonderful news coverage. It's fascinating to listen to you both. I understand that there are some topics that you prefer not to talk about on YouTube due to the policies that they have. There are a lot of things that I want to discuss with you, but since time is short, I'll try to stick to some points. Well, there's currently a lot of discussions about China, as you say, and the possible conflict that might emerge with the U.S. There are people who think that, for instance, that even nuclear war is on the table, but personally, I don't believe that, because the international economy is so tightly intertwined between the people of the U.S. and the countries that are united with the U.S., the countries that are allied with China, I suppose is the best way to put it. Sorry, I'm not as an eloquent speaker as the Oracle of London, I have to say. Well, the thing, what I'm trying to say is that the nuclear war is out of the question, because we've seen what happened when a tanker got stuck in a canal a few days ago. All the ripple effects that it sent all the way down through the world economy have been felt pretty much everywhere. And a nuclear war will no doubt crash the economy. So nobody's going with two brain cells to rub together will possibly put that on the table. However, I do think there is a possibility of certain, how should I put it, battles for influence using military, like in the South China Sea, for instance, where there's fleets being deployed, and where the U.S. There are people in the U.S. who are talking that we need to increase our influence there. There are other people there who say we shouldn't. That's just a waste of money. I personally disagree with that fact, because history shows that, basically history has shown us that there have been, whenever new powers emerge and begin to expand, they inevitably clash with other powers. Like with in World War II, for instance, people say that the clash between the Japanese and the U.S. was inevitable, because they were both expanding powers and they both needed the control of the trade routes through the Pacific Ocean. When we talk about that's basically what is your opinion on this? I wanted to ask, do you think that there will be such clashes in the future?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think anybody in Washington or Beijing or Moscow wants to see nuclear war. I say that, there may be some fanatical people who would be prepared to risk it, but they are extremely few. And I think they're very isolated. And I think if we ever found ourselves in a situation where it was seriously threatened, it would be because of a complete collapse of statesmanship and statecraft. It would certainly not be because that is what anybody is planning or intending to do. Precisely for the reasons you said, nuclear war would be devastating and launching one would be suicidal. Having said that, I think we can't completely discount the possibility that there may be some kind of a clash. And we've come, I think, surprisingly close to clashes on several occasions. What tends to take place is because the great powers, and let's specifically talk now about China and the United States in the South China Sea, both sense that war, out and out war, is not going to happen. That has encouraged them to play a game of bluff with each other. So the Chinese will occupy or build or create one artificial island. The United States will move a ship closer. The Chinese will send airplanes to monitor it. And through this sort of game of poker that they play in the South China Sea, sometimes one side feels that it's in a weaker position, so it will pull back, and another side will then move incrementally a step forward. The risk is that one side or another miscalculates, and they misread the other side. So they think that they've piled off enough military assets, warships, submarines, aircraft, troops in a particular place, and that has put them in such a position of advantage that the other side is going to retreat and won't risk war by sort of standing firm. And then the other side doesn't think in those terms and does stand firm, and then some kind of a clash happens. And if there is a military clash, then we don't really know. We've no actual frame for trying to work out what the reactions from that point are going to be, especially if it is public. Would it be controlled in the way that, say, the Indian-Chinese clashes, which have recently happened on their common border, in the end were controlled? Or would it potentially spiral out of control, with neither side wanting to pull back as the thing seems to escalate? We just don't know, because that's never really happened. And at that point, if there is an escalation, we can see that political face becomes increasingly invested, and things perhaps might get even worse. They might escalate even beyond any point that leaders on either side anticipate. The nearest scenario we got to that during the Cold War was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I believe in Russia people still call the Caribbean Crisis, where again,
yes, we do.
it was very, very difficult for the two sides, as they maneuvered around each other, to understand quite where this was going. And there were incidents, it turns out, where the Russians in Cuba shot down American U-2 spy planes, and the political leadership in Moscow, Khrushchev, was apparently absolutely livid when he heard about this, because the one thing he did understand, Khrushchev did understand, is that if actual fighting started publicly, then the whole thing could spiral completely out of control. In that instance, the restraint of certain military people, who were involved in the conflict. There's that famous Russian submarine officer, Soviet submarine officer, who refused to launch the nuclear torpedo. But also the political leaders, people like Khrushchev and Kennedy, they understood how to pull back and to keep the situation under control. What we just don't know is that if we found ourselves in the same kind of situation in the South China Sea, would the same kind of political controls exist again? We just don't know that. And one hopes that they would, but, it took the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you like, for the kind of structures that developed during the second part of the Cold War to be created that made nuclear war essentially impossible. And at the moment, those don't exist. So we don't yet have, I'm sure we don't have, any intention on any party's side to start that kind of a conflict. But it seems to me that we are at that stage where by accident it might happen.
Yes, well, the thing about it is that the U.S., well, this stream basically demonstrated, the U.S. has a leadership crisis. So there isn't really anyone to reel them in case something goes wrong. And now, since you mentioned India, where do you think they will stand in the conflict if it starts? Is there any reason for them to support China by any chance? Because after all, no, I'm sorry. There are still some issues that they have with the US. But
India has huge issues with China. It also has issues with the US. You're absolutely correct. One of the big, I think, miscalculations that some people in Washington are making is that with this meeting of the so-called Quad, the Quad is Australia, Japan, I think it's Taiwan and India. No, maybe not Taiwan, but India certainly is a member of it. There is this assumption that India has now become a US ally against China because India has so many issues against China. My own interpretation of India is completely different. I think India is very much a rising power. It considers itself to be a rising power. It has issues with China, obviously, and it is seeking leverage over China and at the same time hedging against China by tilting towards the US, but it remains ultimately an independent actor. And if there is a major conflict in the South China Sea between the US and China, I think India will stay out. I think any expectation the US might have that India would weigh in on the US's side and risk being drawn into some kind of gigantic superpower confrontation is completely wrong. I think at that point the Indians would actually call for restraint. That's what I think the Indians would do. And I think that's possibly one of the factors, a misunderstanding of Indian policy that might play into some of the miscalculations that people in Washington are making. And your point about the absence of a strong leadership in Washington to act as a brake, as a restraint in the event of a crisis is absolutely spot on. There is no John Kennedy figure who's able to say to the military, look, we're not going to go to war. We're not going to start World War III. We're going to do a deal. It may not be optimal in terms of everything we want. We might have to pull back missiles from Turkey and where we base them in order to get the Soviets to move their missiles out of Cuba. It may be that we'll have to give the Soviets guarantees about Cuba, which we might not want otherwise to give. But ultimately, that's my decision. I am the president. I have the constitutional authority. I consider World War III as a disaster, and I'm going to call people back. And we know from the historians who have followed the Cuban Missile Crisis that there were people in the administration who did want to push harder and to go for a confrontation. And we don't know as much, at least in the West, at least I don't know as much about what kind of discussions were taking place in Moscow. But I wouldn't be surprised that there were some people there also who perhaps said to themselves, well, Cuba is an opportunity for us to sort out various problems. We could march into Berlin, for example, which we have all kinds of issues with. So we don't know what was going on. But there aren't those leaders today in Washington who can act as that brake, as that kind of restraint if there is a conflict of that nature in future.
Thank you very much, Alex. Just before I go, one small thing that I wanted to ask. You do know about the three great clubs, like the Paris Club, London Club, the Roman Club, the Club of Rome, as it's called. I just wanted to ask, is there any way to get some more information about what they're doing and if there's anything that they're planning? Because quite frankly, their actions are actually very important.
They are hugely important. And of course, precisely because they are so important, they don't like to tell us very much about what they're doing, because part of the nature of the exercise of power is that you don't exercise it too publicly. Secrecy. Having said that, the important way to find out is to find out who is involved in these institutions, and then to look at what they're saying and what they're writing. It's a big topic. Maybe because I think you appear fairly regularly on our programs, I'll see if I can find out a few things and perhaps get back to you.
Well, that'll be very nice of you. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Once again, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Totally pleasure talking to you. All right, let's bring in Ferdy. And then we got Alan, Life of Brian, and Susan. Ferdy, I'm adding you to the stream.
Yes.
How you doing, Ferdy?
I am fine. Hello. Finally, I'll be able to talk to you.
All right. Great to have you here.
I watch your videos every day, so it feels like I'm living with you already.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much.
I miss Cyprus. I've been golfing there on Aphrodite Hills a lot,
wow.
And
Beautiful.
it's fantastic. It's just a fantastic country.
Yeah,
anyway, my question is there any insight, any news about the death of Magufuli, the president of Tanzania?
Tanzania, yes.
I'll be straightforward about this. This is news I am very unfamiliar.
Well, we have to be very, very careful, Alexander, as well, and Ferdy, because he was the one country that he was ruling over the one country that was not.
That's right.
Doing the usual lockdown routine. And everyone that's watching this knows what we mean, and everyone that watches this knows why we need to be careful with this. But his death, he was 60 years old, I believe, too. He was a young guy.
Yes. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't have any information. It's something that obviously we do. One would like to know more, and but I can't answer it more clearly than that. I don't know whether Alex, you have any.
His replacement is said to be much more open to implementing much of the WHO policy. 61 years. I'm looking here at the live stream. 61 years old, and I hear the person that's set up to replace him is going to implement much of the policies that we see around the world. So I'm not sure that anyone knows. Ferdy, to be honest, I don't know if you know. I don't know if anyone really knows what happened. I don't know
anything. I'm just to my mind, it's very smelly. This whole story, and
it could be. He died. Okay, but it could be on the exact opposite end as well. Like you said, it could be very.
It's just so
very suspicious. But we're never going to know, are we?
Yeah.
No.
Probably not.
No.
Probably
not. We'll never know.
Yeah.
We'll never know. That's the bottom line. As with many things that we've seen over the past 2-3 years.
Well, indeed.
Another thing is what one of my predecessors said about the class actions by the German lawyer. He actually is called Rainer Füllmich, and he is a very well-connected lawyer. He practices law in America and in Germany, and is very well connected around the world. I don't know if you heard of him.
No.
Well, he is on these class actions which start in Canada and should go on in America, and he also is trying to. He tried to sue. The chemist who is with the German government, Drosten, but actually even the courts in Germany are stonewalling the whole process, and and he is talking about suing all these big shots according to the Nuremberg laws, but if you want my opinion, there's no way that all these governments are going to get locked up. There's no way.
I'm afraid that your skepticism may very well be warranted. If you don't mind, could you perhaps either on a chat or somehow or other send us a contact, some information about this particular German lawyer, because he sounds a very interesting man indeed, and I'd like to know more about him.
Absolutely, there's a website, and he does online conferences all the time,
Right.
with various people.
Okay.
He's also connected with what's his name, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or something.
Oh right,
yeah.
Who has been in Germany for the protests and things like that.
Interesting.
But I can send the links to Alex.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Send those links, please.
Please do, because I would be very, very interested, and I would obviously I have a specific interest in this, but he sounds like a most remarkable and very interesting man in himself. And,
he is. He is
very active. I mean, there's no one, I should say, interestingly enough, in Britain who's pursuing these cases in that kind of way, which is interesting because you would have thought that with the kind of legal culture we've historically had here, there would be, but I don't know of anybody like that in Britain. And perhaps even more surprisingly, I don't know of anybody like that in France. So if there's someone like that in Germany, I definitely want to know about it.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. And I'm
pleasure.
humbled to be in such a highly intellectual circle. I'm really impressed about the people calling in. It's really incredible, and I'm thrilled to be part of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye. All right, let's bring in Alan to the stream. Alan, you're with us. Hey, how you doing?
I'm okay. Some great calls today. Fantastic. I really enjoyed that one from Alex. But what I want to ask you is, who is the biggest enemy at the moment of the EU? Is it the British Parliament or is it Putin? And to follow on from that, I get the feeling that the British government is wavering. It's not so enthusiastic about this big Russia bashing plan that's been instituted by the Biden administration. I get the feeling that the British government is moving around and not so enthusiastic about what's happening. The other thing is that Biden being on that meeting with the EU, Biden being in on a Zoom call, that's disturbing. That's disturbing from the British government's point of view, especially if they didn't know about it. The other thing is, to add on to it, is that what you think about China sanctioning half a dozen or more British politicians yesterday. Thanks very much. I'll keep it like that. Brilliant guys. Brilliant stream.
Thank you, Alan.
Alexander,
before you answer that, I'll give you my take real quick. The biggest enemy of the EU is the EU. Alexander.
I completely agree. I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. But if we compare who is creating more trouble, more problems for the EU at this moment in time, Britain or Russia, the straightforward answer is it's Britain. And now I don't mean here the British government. I certainly don't mean here the British Parliament. I mean Britain as a nation. Its decision to leave has been an earthquake. It's a shock. And that is something that the Russians have never done and cannot do because they are not part of it. I mean, we can't have the Russians cannot do what the British said. We say, enough, we are walking away. We're going to vote against it. We're going to vote to leave it in a referendum. And we're going to make absolutely sure that our elected politicians, our leaders, even if they don't want to, they've got to actually do that because that's what we insist. I mean, that is something the EU has never experienced. It never imagined it would experience. It's a shock to the EU. They still don't know how to adjust to it. And as I've said in a program I've just done on my channel, they're acting in all kinds of vindictive and spiteful ways towards Britain, like trying to stop exports of certain medical products. We have to be careful what we say in order to spite Britain, because that's what that whole thing is all about. So Britain is far and away the greatest threat to the EU after the EU is itself. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's my own personal view. Now, on the question of British policy towards Russia, I think that the British government is divided. I think there are some people in the government who are still deeply committed to this policy of confrontation with Russia. I think they're viscerally anti-Russian. I don't think they have any real capacity to think beyond that. I think that is very much their view. I don't think they are the only people. In fact, I can definitely say that they are not, because I know because he's a friend of my wife's, one member of the British government, I'm not going to name him, who I know has a much more open-minded view of these sort of things. And I think Boris Johnson himself has shown in the past that he would be more than willing, if he could find the political space, to actually start mending fences with the Russians. In fact, I'm going to go even further. I think we discussed this last week. I think that if people in Britain think this thing through properly, there is a actually very good potential partnership between British capital and British financial services and British know-how in that field with the Russians, who have, industries and agriculture and natural resources, but who are well behind Britain in those sort of fields. And I think if they two work together in that way, I think they would make a big political, economic partnership, and they could also make a very good and very healthy political and diplomatic partnership also. And it may come. I mean, it's happened before. It may come. At the moment, it seems unlikely, because the forces that push towards hostility are greater. But necessity, as they say, is the strongest teacher. Britain faces an EU which shows itself to be extremely hostile to Britain. We see the Biden administration, we see Joe Biden attending European Council meetings, and you're quite right, it'd be very disturbing. I think the British government would be very concerned about it if they weren't informed about it in advance. And even if they were informed about it in advance, it's still very disturbing. It's still extremely disturbing from their point of view. So we see the Biden administration is now cozying up to Germany, essentially, and to the Europeans. Britain risks being left out in the cold. It's got itself into, China's far away. Perhaps the time has come for the British to think again and to consider their relationship with the Russians. And perhaps when and if they do, they will find how well it will work for them. It's happened twice before. It happened in the run-up to the First World War. There'd been a very long history of difficult relations between the British and the Russians throughout the 19th century. The British backed the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. But eventually, the British and the Russians came together. They came to all kinds of agreements in 1907 over spheres of influence, for example, in Central Asia, and they became eventually friends. And in the First World War, they became allies. And it worked for the British then. And of course, in the Second World War, the same thing happened all over again. So maybe it's not impossible. Something similar could happen once more. But it will need to overcome a lot of resistance within Britain before it does happen. I'm just going to finish, by the way, with one. Somebody asked me, I think it was somebody from Russia actually asked me in a program a short time ago, one of our earlier programs, about what Russian films I've seen. I forgot to mention two really remarkable adaptations that I've seen. One is Russian film adaptations. One of the Sherlock Holmes stories, which dates from the 1980s, which is most extraordinary. And another one, believe it or not, of Mary Poppins. There's actually a Russian version of Mary Poppins, also made in the 1980s. And one of the things that really struck me about both of these films is the very strong Anglophilia that they both express. So there is that goodwill there, which I don't think has been completely dissipated away. The British were to change their policy towards Russia, I think they would find the Russians absolutely open to talking with Britain and to working with the British going forward.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
What about the Chinese sanctioning British politicians?
Well. I mean,
Funny.
it is funny. I mean, yeah, you're quite sorry. I forgot to mention that it is funny, and of course, it's to be honest, it's funny. It's rather pointless. I mean, British sanctions on China are meaningless. Chinese sanctions on British people are equally meaningless. But it does show that this policy that David Cameron and George Osborne had when they were, in charge of things, which is not actually so long ago. It seems like an age, but it's 2016, which is to get as close to China as possible. They talked about a golden age of relations between Britain and China. Well, that seems to me, at least for the moment, well and truly gone. I think it's illusory anyway. Yeah,
definitely. I agree with you totally about the need for a closer relationship with Russia, but it's interesting to see Biden's take and going to the EU. And I noticed in his conference, he mentioned the fact that his grandfather came to the United States to get away from the Brits.
Yeah,
well, indeed.
Yeah,
well, indeed.
exactly. Anyway,
well, Biden wasn't happy with Brexit, and he made it known, as Obama did. I mean,
Absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, I would add, by the way, that Biden has never shown very much interest in Britain. The only thing I'd known about him before in relation to Britain was that he plagiarized the speech of one of our former Labour opposition leaders, and that was back in the 1980s. So I don't think he's ever really been very drawn to Britain, actually.
Thanks very much, guys. Have a good weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. Have a good weekend. All right, let's bring in Susan. We have Susan and Life of Brian, and we'll wrap up the calls and get to some Discord server questions, super chats, and keep the show rolling. Susan.
Hey, can you hear me, Alex?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Susan,
we
how are you
can.
doing?
Great, I'm well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me back on. And tonight I wanted to ask you about the Uyghur being held in China, if that's okay, because there's been quite a bit of chat that we've been engaging in tonight about them. I just wanted to point out that there are about 12 million stateless people in the world while we're talking about human trafficking. And just to point out to the audience that these people quite often have their identities manipulated or suppressed by the states that they live in, so that they're very easily captured, either held en masse in prisons or in terribly impoverished conditions, or deported to various places that their states choose in partnership with other states, or with no partnership with other states, where they're dumped in other countries such as Iraq. Now, I just wanted to mention that the Uyghur is sometimes considered a stateless nation by some. And tonight, Reckless Abandon and a few of us were having a bit of a chat about the Uyghur, and he made an interesting comment where he thought that the around 1 million Uyghur were being held in China as a containment strategy so that China could contain the Uyghur to prevent them from being trained by the US as jihadists. Now, in my experience, statelessness has always been treated as a bit of a non-starter by the United Nations, and in particular finding that through the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review processes, that different countries very specifically make efforts to maintain these large stateless populations, to actually prevent them from being granted citizenship by any countries around the world, let alone their own countries. Now, following on by that, reckless abandon led me to wonder, other stateless populations around the world, being around 12 million, including the Uyghur and the ones in the Middle East in particular, not only persecuted by their own states and the UN, I just wanted to ask you, do you think that one of the things that they may be used for is what Reckless Abandon said, to prevent jihadist training? This is why the Uyghur might be in prison, to prevent them from leaking out and going across to the Middle East, or being in China causing disturbance after being trained by the CIA and their groups that they sponsor that will train them as fighters? Or do you think that they are part of the human trafficking system that supplies the world, in particular the West, with blood products and organs? And here we have, possibly China as well. And just as the last tidbit to asking your opinion about this, Alexander, is noting that David Hawkins on the Jason Goodman show, who's a British researcher, who has a number of patents in his name, he's an extremely intelligent fellow, has pointed out that Bill Clinton pioneered the collection of blood products from prisoners imprisoned in Arkansas state jails when he was a senator or the governor of that state. So I just wanted to link it up to there finally and ask you your opinion about those two streams of destiny for the Uyghurs and other stateless people.
They say, Alexander and Susan, real quick, going off of what you said on Clinton, just real quick, they say that much of the war in Yugoslavia was all about creating that link from Middle East, Europe, through Kosovo into Arkansas. That's what I've read as well. So that's
into Arkansas.
Yeah, that's what I've read.
Alex.
I don't have any. Obviously, I don't have any concrete proof. I don't think anyone does, but I have read that. That is true.
I
That
might
is a
go
true
see
statement.
if I can find some.
Yeah, that is a true statement.
Well,
Susan Alexander.
Well, that is extraordinary. That's fascinating, actually. I mean, I've heard bad stories, bad facts about. I don't think they're stories anymore. I think they're established facts about Kosovo and about trafficking in body parts that have happened from Kosovo. But I wasn't aware of that angle. Now, about the Uyghurs, I went to China in 2017. I spent time in Shanghai. I did not go to these regions in the West of the Chinese People's Republic. So I'm not able to comment from direct observation. But what did immediately strike me, and I think anybody who goes to China is going to be struck by it, is the degree of control that the Chinese government already and always has over its own citizens. I mean, I should say most of them take it naturally. They don't feel oppressed by it, but that is the reality. And I think, given that the Chinese government undoubtedly does perceive a threat in Xinjiang province, they've talked about that. They've talked about the danger of jihadi penetration into Xinjiang province, and they've had long historic conflicts with the nationalists, with the local nations of these regions, who are, of course, not ethnic Han Chinese. I can very well believe, in fact, I have no doubt at all, that a government that is as concerned about control as the Chinese government is would go much further in Xinjiang province and would take radical steps, and steps which we would consider in the West completely unacceptable, and would condemn, and would, in my opinion, in my personal feeling, rightly condemn, that the Chinese government would take steps like that if it felt that its position in Xinjiang province was indeed threatened. And I would add also, on top of that, that of course for China, control of these regions of Western Asia, of East and Central Asia, they consider it to be absolutely essential to their security and to their conception of China as a great power. So they will take whatever steps they consider necessary to control these regions. They have a habit of control. I'm sure they have enforced that control very rigorously in Xinjiang province. I'm sure there have been human rights violations. And I'm afraid where human rights violations happen, where there is no responsibility and there is no accountability, then I'm afraid all sorts of other even worse things happen. And I would not be at all surprised if there are some people, I'm not saying I know this, I'm not saying this is the case, but I would not be surprised if some people involved in these processes have taken advantage of it in the way that you have described. What I am saying is that the one does not necessarily exclude the other. There may be an actual threat of jihadism to the China's control in Xinjiang province. The Chinese government may perceive a legitimate, a real danger from jihadism there. It may have reacted in a certain way to that threat. That might also have led not just to human rights abuses, but to the kind of egregious actions that you talked about. Now, problems of stateless persons are some things that I've had to learn a great deal about because, as it happens, my niece is currently writing a thesis on this topic. And you're absolutely right. There are millions of people around this world, around the world, who fall within that definition. Of course, the Chinese government would strongly dispute any definition of the people, the Uyghur people of Xinjiang province, as stateless. As far as China is concerned, they are Chinese nationals and Chinese citizens. But stateless persons do exist around the world. They are often the most vulnerable people. They are often manipulated in the most brutal and cynical and coercive ways, not just by governments, but by violent groups, including by terrorist groups, and also by criminal groups. And sometimes these people who find themselves in these situations are undoubtedly preyed upon in exactly the kind of way that you've described, with sort of trade in body parts and all that sort of thing. In fact, it becomes inevitable. You hear stories of people, for example, giving up internal organs in order to help them to find their ways to Europe or wherever. I mean, I know for a fact that that happens. So all sorts of things like that do take place. Now, the way we counter it, obviously, we have to take care of the dignity and the rights of people wherever they are. And at the same time, we must do so in an objective way and in an impartial way. We mustn't politicize these issues in the way that is being done. I mean, one of the concerns I have, for example, about Xinjiang province is the way certain Western politicians are using this issue as part of a quarrel with China, which isn't ultimately about Xinjiang province. Let's be quite clear about that. But also, and it's important to say this, we have to stop wars. Because again, I know from this thesis that my niece is writing, I know from information I've been given by my brother, who's been very heavily involved in dealing with the refugee inflow into Greece, that the major driver of making people stateless, of creating refugee flows, are all of these illegal wars. I call them illegal because that's what they are. All of these illegal wars that have taken place in the Middle East, in Africa, and in all sorts of other places. They have created, to an extraordinary degree, this absolute breakdown in legal and political systems and in borders, which have resulted in these flows of people in this sort of way, which cause enormous disruption, both to the societies where these people come and to the societies where these people leave, and leave these people themselves in a position of acute, even desperate vulnerability, where they can be very easily taken advantage of. Now, I'm afraid that's a complicated answer to a important and powerful question. I think we could talk about this for a long time. I'm very glad to learn that you and Reckless Abandon have already been having discussions about this. It's certainly a subject we should return to in future, and let's in fact do so, and let's in fact have more comments about this from people who are listening to this program on our threads, on our Discord server, and in future questions in our live streams.
That would be fantastic. Thank you so much for your comprehensive answer, Alexander. And thanks for the terrific show, guys. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
Susan. Thank you very much. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you.
All right, Alexander, let's do some questions here.
Indeed.
From Asavet MD, $15 super chat. Thank you very much, Asavet MD. From Anatoly, thank you once again. Have a good weekend. Thank you, Anatoly. Great to speak with you.
Absolutely.
Call in.
Yeah.
From Iris, 199 super sticker. Thank you very much, Iris, for that. Let me zoom in here real quick. Here. All right, there you are. There's the Oracle of London. All right, let's keep the show moving along. Alexander, let's pop into the Discord server here. From Davwill171, with concern to the current antics of YouTube, is there a possibility that your world-renowned Friday live stream can or could be hosted at a more friendly venue? Thank you for your splendid work and answering my emails I sent from time to time. Thank you very much. Well, videos we have, we're on Rumble, we're on BitChute, we're on Odyssey, which is a fantastic platform. Odyssey is a really great platform, but live streams is a little more tricky. And there is DLive and some other platforms, but it's just not the same. I've heard that Rumble is piloting a live stream platform. If they get something going and it looks good and we get invited to do live streams there, absolutely, we'd love to get more exposure on alternative tech. But for now, live streaming is a monopoly of YouTube's for the time being. And we were talking about big tech monopoly, and unfortunately, YouTube is one of the only games in town for that. Let's see, where else? Toilet Sauce came in with a super chat. Merkel's demise seems to me suspiciously orchestrated. I felt the same way about Schroeder's demise as chancellor, even though I was very young back then. Something feels off.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have to say that Merkel's demise has been very long in coming, and has taken much longer to happen than I expected. I mean, I was wondering whether she would be around in 2015. And here she is, 6 years on, and she's still there, and prime ministers in Britain don't usually last as long as she has, since I first predicted that Merkel's problems would start to get out of hand. So I don't know. I think on balance, it's for real. I think that opinion in Germany is starting to shift strongly against her. And I think that it's not difficult when you look at the underlying facts about Germany to understand why. But about Gerhard Schroeder, I completely agree. I mean, I think that Gerhard Schroeder made himself deeply unpopular, let's put it like this, with certain very, very powerful people because of certain stances which he took. He got very close to Putin. He became a close friend of Putin's. He was the person who started Nord Stream 1. And of course, he opposed the Iraq war. And I think all of that was enough in itself to make it inevitable, perhaps, that he would start to bring a great deal of opposition against him, not just in Germany, but outside. I would add that, of course, there were also reasons within Germany why Schroeder lost support. I mean, he carried out certain very radical social and economic reforms, which were unpopular with a very significant part of German society, and which I think not only forfeited him support within Germany, but also lost the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, a significant amount of support from its base and that has never returned. So there were factors that were in play which led to Schroeder's demise, but I think that there was some element of orchestration about it. I'm not so sure that's true with Merkel. That's my view anyway.
Okay, let's go to the Discord. Alex P95, with all the money printing, will that crash the dollar?
Yeah, well, I think
a lot of people want to know.
A lot
will that crash the dollar?
A lot of people not want to know, and I think ultimately the answer probably is yes. At least crash. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe a different word than crash.
Yeah. Maybe a different word than crash, but I don't think this is a good way, I'm putting it mildly, to run an economy. I think it's a terrible way to run an economy. I think it's a terrible way to run a currency. The United States is enormously rich, powerful country, has tremendous resources, a tremendously entrepreneurial population. I've said that so many times on these programs, I'm repeating myself. I'm sorry for doing that. But I think what, our famous English writer said, there's a lot of ruin in a country. There's an awful lot of ruin in the United States before it really gets to the point of no return. But printing money in this way is eventually, if it goes on unabated in the way that it's been happening, it will in the end bring about very bad outcomes indeed for the United States, for the American people, and of course for the dollar. So I think that has to be something that people who care about the United States should try to find some way of getting out of. And if that means, reversing many of the economic and geostrategic policies which are leading to this outcome, in other words, retrenching, pulling back, starting to impose trade barriers, which of course the United States
that in Trump.
They had that in Trump, exactly. But but also protection was, the policy that Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, the United States classically used to follow. Build up domestic industries, get away from money printing, follow a more conventional monetary and economic policies, give up on the empire, in fact. Then I think that you would probably find that things would right themselves. But it has to be done. And I think time is starting now to run out. I'm not saying it's going to happen next year or the year after, but it can't go on for much longer like this.
Well, it definitely won't happen on Joe Biden's watch, or at least that's what he told us at the press conference. All right.
Well, going back to the comment you made before, Alex, that all but guarantees that it will.
Yeah, unfortunately, you hear that coming out of a politician's mouth, it means the exact opposite. All right, from Toilet Sauce wants to follow up on the super chat with Merkel and Schroeder. He says, I think she lasted this long because she was supposed to and because the media was on her side.
Absolutely, I entirely agree. I mean, the point about Angela Merkel is that there has never, she has political skills, that's indisputable, but no other political leader, apart from Sleepy Joe today, has been propped up to the extent that she has been. I mean, the entire political system in Germany, in Europe, in the West, has worked overtime to keep Merkel and Merkelism going. And that is absolutely correct. And I agree 100%. It's not to dispute her very real political skills. They're not the kind of political skills I admire. I mean, their skills of public relations and intrigue and those sort of things. But there's no doubt that she possesses them and that they've served her well in remaining chancellor for as long as she has.
All right, from Mark Hewitt, the election for London mayor will take place soon. A win for Javid could be disastrous for London and the UK as a whole.
Absolutely, I agree. I think he's a terrible mayor. I know a lot of Labour people, by the way, who think the same. The problem is there doesn't seem to be an alternative against him. And this is a problem, by the way. Again, I'm repeating myself all the time. A terrible leader in Merkel, but no obvious person to take over. Terrible situations in many places, but absence of leadership to rival these bad, poor, mediocre leaders that you find. We have an election in London, and the Conservative opponent who campaigns against Javid complains in Watford, which is a sort of suburb, but he doesn't seem to realise that the people in Watford don't actually have a vote in the election in London. It's most bizarre. What's going on? Why do we have somebody? Why are the Conservatives putting up somebody against Javid, who I know is unpopular with many people in London and who seems likely to lose if he has an effective candidate pitted against him? Why did they then go and find somebody who seems almost, guaranteed to lose even against Javid? And I agree. I think if Javid is re-elected, I think we're going to have a very, very bad situation in London. Of course, we already do. Well, what more can I say?
Yeah. On the one hand, no one wants to run for office nowadays because they understand that the media is just going to completely crush them and smear them. On the flip side, when they do run, when people do decide to run, the media completely smears them and crushes them. And that's where that's why you have to have someone that's going to run, who's going to be opposition, has to be of the make and mold of a Farage or a Trump, someone that's not afraid to take on the media and could just absorb the hits, and not even absorb them, but just hit back harder. You see a little bit of that in DeSantis in Florida, to be quite honest. He is not afraid to take on the media. You need those types of people, but they're very, very rare.
Very, very rare indeed. Very rare. Anyway, I mean, it's increasingly looking as if Labour will do badly in the local elections, which are coming up. I mean, it's not absolutely certain, but that's the trend at the moment. Except in London, where Javid looks likely to be re-elected, because there is no effective opposition to him. And given that, London, I should say, is a sort of is a left-wing, Labour-inclined city. But even many people in London, I think, are very unhappy at the absence of an effective alternative to Javid, who I think many people are very dissatisfied with altogether.
All right. From Fox Drake 360, thanks for Tom Rivers' mention, a one-horse town. USA mainstream media didn't report Biden's performance. Statements repeated deadpan. He doesn't make it past June. Military must remove Kamala Harris or World War III. I will say this: the media has painted the Biden press conference as magnificent.
Oh,
as
absolutely!
The best ever in history.
Absolutely. I've been reading some really bizarre commentaries, actually, in especially the British media, obviously, is where I go. But the British media has become practically a sort of London London section of the US media. It's very strange to see the way they cover, very weird to see how they cover US policy. But the way they talk about this press conference, I read a most bizarre article in the Financial Times, which said, the great genius of Biden is that, he's vacuous and doesn't say anything. This is apparently how to govern. It's genius. Exactly. It proves what an outstanding president he is, and how this makes everybody, feel more emollient and, better, and feel better about themselves, because the president himself runs off on weird tangents and can't remember what he's saying.
In other words, his hiding is genius.
Absolutely,
it's a genius move. Yeah.
Yes. It's been some very, very strange commentary about Biden since he became president, and of course about his press conference. Well, exactly the same. When the British media covers it, which they haven't really very much, but to the extent that they have, It was an absolutely stellar performance. It was, Churchill or Lloyd George or Franklin Roosevelt, great orators of the past. Well, they don't hold a candle to Biden, who supposedly captured the mood of the moment and electrified everybody. I mean, it's weird things have been said.
Yeah. All right, let's do some more super chats here. Keep things rolling. We've got some good questions from Rubies 200. What's your analysis on digital pass certificates? They are rolling out everywhere now. I mean, it's my prediction, Alexander, is in the next month they're going to become pretty much ubiquitous.
I agree.
They're really rolling out like crazy.
I completely agree. I think they're going to happen. I'm sure they're going to happen. One government, by the way, which continues to say that it is completely and absolutely opposed to them, and one leader who has said that they're not going to happen in his country, the Russian government and Vladimir Putin. So it's quite interesting to see how this country, which is supposed to be the repressive place, they're totally opposed, and they've completely set their face against this kind of thing. Just say,
yeah, Russia is definitely bucking the trend, but in Europe, it's going to be everywhere.
I agree. I think it's almost inevitable. I mean, Boris Johnson might shift position, as I discussed earlier in the program, but on this, I think the momentum is almost irresistible. And of course, you see, the trouble is, if some countries do it, they'll put pressure on other countries to do it also. And the way it happens in Europe, especially within the EU, is that they then all fall one after the other like a row of dominoes. And then if the Europeans all do it, then again, the British will follow. I don't think there's any doubt about it.
Yeah. All right. From Mark Gardam, Trump is running a shadow gov, hence Biden's nerves. Interesting that the Dems can't get done what they hoped. Just shows their ignorance of the system.
The point about a shadow government is actually quite interesting, because I don't think Trump actually is, but Biden talks as if Trump is. It's very weird. Sometimes you almost get the sense, listening to what Biden was saying in that press conference, that Donald Trump was still the president. It's very weird. And he even said at one point that he missed Donald Trump. It's almost as if Donald Trump was needed to make the decisions which Biden himself can't make. It was all very odd, very strange indeed. But Trump is down, but he's certainly not out. And in fact, he's not that down anymore either. He's coming back, and we'll see whether this platform that he's talking about, what it will be.
That's the key. Let's see the platform that launches. That's the key to it all. All right. From Paul Wooten, $5 super chat. Thank you very much, Paul. From Eugene is a member to the Duran community, as is 63 Ramblers, a new member to the Duran community. Welcome. Great to have you on board. From Asavet MD, a $20 super chat. Thank you very much, Asavet MD, for that super chat. And a $5 super sticker from Iris Namorado. Thank you very much, Iris, for that super sticker. Let's see here. Toilet Sauce has a super chat here, which says Biden taking part in this EU meeting reminds me an awful lot of Biden chairing meetings in the Ukraine. That is a great observation.
Superb observation.
In this case, I would say that Biden chairing EU meetings is more like you said, Alexander, just probably kind of letting the EU know that the US is still watching them in a way.
Absolutely. I have to say, I still find it an extraordinary move and almost completely unreported, which in itself is interesting and rather suggestive. I have to say, I'm still absorbing it, but the implications, I think, are awesome. And you can be absolutely sure that everybody within the EU is talking about it, and certainly, as Alan said, in London they will be too.
Yeah, you think that it's just about the US kind of saying, okay, Biden, you're going to sit on this meeting, you're going to chair it because we need you to be there because we need to exert our control over the EU. In other words, the EU, let's take it back. Let's take it a step back. The EU got nervous after the week that Biden had, which was a disastrous week. Putin is a killer. The Harris is president. I mean, it was probably one of the worst weeks I've ever seen in a president in my lifetime. The EU got nervous and they needed a Biden figure to sit there and say, you know, we're still here, guys. That kind of sense.
Absolutely. By the way, I understand the meeting was not actually chaired by Biden. It was chaired by Claude Michel, who is, of course, the president of the European Council. That makes it worse for me, because that confirms that what we're talking about is a proper, an institutional, if you like, European Council meeting chaired by its normal chairman, its normal chair. And yet somebody who is not a member of that council sits on it and participates in the discussions. That is an extraordinary thing. That is most remarkable. I've never heard anything like that happen before. And I'm amazed that there's been so little comment or discussion of it. But I think you're right. I think the intention was to remind the Europeans that the United States is indeed there, that it's still the senior partner in this whole enterprise, that it still in effect calls the shots, even if the US itself is not handling things terribly well at the moment, getting humiliated by the Chinese in Anchorage, the president blundering into an argument with Putin that he never intended to, all that sort of thing. Big question for me is, how was this arranged? Who issued that invitation? Presumably there was an invitation to Biden to attend that meeting. How did the White House arrange it? Did anybody object? Was there a single member of the European Council who stood up and said, hold on a minute, what is the President of the United States doing attending a meeting of the highest body of the EU when the United States is not a member of the EU? I mean, you know, there's so many questions. All we know at the moment is the fact that this took place. Certainly the European public doesn't know, and that's extraordinary.
Extraordinary. All right. From we Kieran, €20 super chat. Thank you very much for that. Let's see where else we have some from Toilet Sauce. Comment on Mishustin's reform as prime minister. Are you familiar with his administrative reform? Do you also have the impression that he is traveling much more to the regions? Actually, Mishustin was in Greece to celebrate the 200 bicentennial anniversary. So he is traveling more.
Absolutely. And can I just say, because I've spoken to various people about this. Richard Sackwer, who is a scholar of Russian affairs and an academic at Kent University in Canterbury, for example. People are becoming increasingly impressed by Mishustin. First of all, I should say that he completely reorganized, before he became prime minister, the entire system of tax collection and tax recording that took place in Russia, and did it with superb skill. And the result is that the Russians have what is possibly the most efficient tax system in the world. And it isn't just tax that they're able to collect through this incredible digital system that he created, but they're able to track even the most microscopic movements in prices, because they know what happens in every cash deal around this enormous country. They're able to know the most infinitely small movement in prices everywhere. And apparently he is turning out to be a brilliant manager and organizer. And as you absolutely rightly said, somebody who's taking a very prominent public role and is moving around the regions and is taking an interest in the regions much more. He also comes across, by the way, as far less of a liberal than his predecessor Medvedev did.
He may be the heir apparent
Absolutely. I'm starting.
I'm starting to get that feeling.
I'm starting to hear people talk in this fashion. Apparently, he has a good relationship with the power ministries, the people who run the defense and foreign ministries and those sort of things. And and he appears to be generally, people are starting to like him and to take note of him. So he is clearly a cunning man. And I think this reform that he's carried out of the government is both effective, and he's putting interesting people in important positions and clearing out some of the sort of more liberal people. I'm sorry to use those terms, but I think everybody knows what I mean. The sort of free market people that had been there before, and he's bringing his own people in, and they all look rather impressive. So I definitely think he's someone to watch, and someone I personally take extremely seriously.
If we see him traveling more and doing more state visits, then I think he is definitely the front runner to take over after Putin. That's what I would guess at.
I agree. I completely agree.
Yeah, and people always ask us, who do you think is going to take over after Putin? I think that he's pulling out to be a front runner.
Absolutely.
Okay, from Flying Boar, when will the EU lift sanctions on Russia?
Well, as far as the Russians are concerned, it doesn't matter when. Who cares? Well, on balance, if anything, I know there are some Russians, but not just some Russians, lots of Russians, at least elite Russians, who think the sanctions have worked out excellently. I think they've been able to. The Russians have used the sanctions to do all sorts of things which might have been difficult and unpopular to do in Russia before, like, invest in agriculture, engage in import substitution, limit imports, invest in infrastructure, all those kind of things, which cut against lots of interests. So from the Russian point of view, I think the sanctions actually have been over time, not initially. Initially, they were difficult, but over time, quite helpful. I think one of the things that Josip Borrell was absolutely shocked when he went to Moscow was, I think he thought the Russians were nervous and worried about sanctions. And I think he was stunned when he found that the Russians' response when he threatened them with sanctions was, bring it on, bring them on. We don't care anymore. And I noticed that Peskov, who was Putin's spokesman, he was recently asked, does Russia fear disconnection from SWIFT? And he said, no, we're ready. That's not quite what he said, but it's essentially what he said.
Yeah, God, the people in the EU really do live in a bubble. They really
do live. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Borrell absolutely does. I mean, it was actually one of the most, I have to say, at times it was actually quite funny watching Borrell and reading his various things. I mean, it was. To those of us who've become increasingly frustrated by, well, let's face it, the arrogance of the Eurocrats, seeing one of them crash and burn and be humiliated in that way, I won't pretend that in my case I didn't have more than a frisson of pleasure.
Yeah, they're arrogant, but they're also just completely incompetent as well. It's really just such a strange combination.
Absolutely.
If they were arrogant and clever and smart and brilliant, then you can say, okay, but they're arrogant and they're just not all that bright.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's entirely right. I mean, can I just, we were asking about Mishustin before. I mean, one of the interesting things about him is he doesn't come across as arrogant. He comes across as very quietly spoken and rather effective. Be interested to see, by the way, I know there's some Russians who are now members of our community. We were hearing from Anatoly. There was somebody called Alexander who joined us last week. We're quite interested to hear what they have to say about Mishustin, actually.
I was impressed with his speech in Greece, actually. He actually seems like he's a pretty relaxed, cool guy, to be quite honest. He really does. He seemed very relaxed being on the world stage.
I agree. I completely agree. I mean, very self-confident, but as I said, not an arrogant man. Anyway, I'd be very interested to hear what Russians think of him. And please let us know, and
All right.
whether any of you do think that he might
Yes.
be, the coming man.
All right, Anatoly sends another super chat with a thumbs up. Thank you very much, Anatoly. From Leon. Leon is a new member. Leon
Yeah.
Kachaturian is a new member to the Duran community. Welcome, Leon. From Sparky, Biden was at the meeting to show the EU that globalism isn't dead yet. It still exists in Washington, D.C., and is ready to repopulate the world.
Well, indeed. I mean, that's quite true. Globalism is far from dead. It's still an extraordinarily powerful force. In fact, it's still the dominant force. I mean, these people are still very much the power, at least in the West they are. But one does get the sense that it's slipping away, and that's making them more aggressive. That's making them double down on what they do, and it makes them more dangerous. So I completely agree with your assessment. I think it's spot on. By the way, I heard the name of the previous person. I think I got it right. Leon Hachaturian. Hachaturian is for me a name that, a tremendous name, one of the greatest composers, wonderful Armenian composer. Wrote some amazing music, ballets like Spartacus and Gayanech, which I absolutely adore.
All right. Yes, that was the name, actually. Very good. Very good catch there. From Asavet MD, $15 super chat. Thank you very much, Asavet MD.
Absolutely. Very much. Very generous.
The checkerboard behind me is not a good look. Okay. All right. From let's see, where else are we? From Fox Drake 360. Cthulhu is pronounced Cthulhu. H.P. Lovecraft. Kamala Cthulhu. Harris. Come on, man. All right, that was from one of the previous super chats. Thank you very much for clarifying that. Yeah, I probably completely butchered the pronunciation of that, or maybe I just didn't even pronounce it.
Gosh.
Yeah, that's a hard one to pronounce, though, to be fair. From Mary Antonia Young, crashing the US dollar preps us for the Great Reset to substitute the dollar for global currency that's tracked on microchipped citizens. Comments?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Crashing the dollar.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are some people who think that way. I mean, we mustn't underestimate the extent to which some people do talk in these fashions. By the way, speaking of, globalization and all of that, I think I'm right in saying that either in the press conference or in some other comments he made recently, Biden came out, as a great supporter of the fourth industrial revolution and all that. So, yes, I think there might be some agenda to this.
He said
Absolutely.
He said it. You're right. He said fourth industrial revolution. Yeah.
Exactly. But can I just say, it's all very well, these people coming up with these wonderful plans about, well, not wonderful, terrible plans about crashing the dollar, and we'll come up with something else, and that will enable us to move forward with our utopia and vision. But if they do that, what they actually are going to do is upturn the United States, its economy, the world economy, and ultimately even themselves. Systems collapse is what you would achieve by doing that. So it seems to me. And it does remind me very much of the attitude of liberals in Russia in the run-up to the Russian Revolution, whose attitude was very much the worse things are, the better, and who worked very hard to undermine the system because they were convinced that when it all collapsed, they would be able to take over. And well, we know what eventually happens to them. Obviously, it wasn't just they who suffered, everybody else did too. But, these are reckless schemes. They're, in fact, I think, lunatic schemes, and they're extremely dangerous. And if there are people around who really think in those terms, they are dangerous to themselves as well as to everyone else.
Yeah. Boris says, I'm Russian. I definitely like Mishustin's more than Medvedev, but I think he is not charismatic person to be president, unlike Putin. He
Yes,
can build
I mean,
charisma.
he can build charisma. The other person, by the way, that I noticed Putin seemed to be, he went out on this adventure, he went on this holiday to the Taiwan with, was Shoigu. And I think Shoigu's a bit on the old side to be the successor, but who knows? Again, I wonder what
I
Russians
can't see Shoigu being the successor.
I
I don't know.
can't.
I just don't see him.
No, I don't see it. I don't see it either. But Boris mentioned charisma, and well, Shoigu does have that. It
He does
seems
have
to me.
charisma,
Yeah.
All right, let's do one quick comment on the Discord. I think we'll wrap it up. We got all the questions in there from Otno says both Chinese society full of control, normalcy, and America senile stream of lies and the censorship to push everyone is evil and scarier, intensely terrifying. Scarier because you eventually can get used to it and believe this is the way it was meant to be. I forgot the EU apparently is laughable and idiotic policies, which are the same in the same vein, dangerous enough too. We'll probably leave it with that sentiment. What do you make of that sentiment?
But I agree with every single part of it. I think it's been wonderfully well said, and thanks for expressing it in that concise and pithy and evocative way. I think that's entirely right. Dangerous for the United States, contemptible in Europe. And China, well, the Chinese do things their way, not the way I would like to live under, but that's the way they do things. But in the US, they used to do things completely differently, and they're not doing them as they once did, and has worked for them, and is natural and right for the United States. And what is being done there is dangerous. And on Europe, I'm not even going to start, because as somebody who has feelings about Europe, I think that if I were to start, well, I would probably say things which would, might get me into trouble. Let me put it
Okay, we'll cap it off with Sparky and a final super chat. And actually, Leon Kachaturian, who you mentioned, actually says in the chat in Calcutta, us Armenians, so you're right, us Armenians played rugby against the Brits there. They were tall, yet we were short Armenians, and we could tackle them good. He said, I played hooker in the scrum, not what you Americans think.
Well, there we go.
All right, got a rugby player. Great. Thank you for that. And Sparky, I'll wrap up. We'll bring home this live stream with his super chat. Globalists are brilliant at the old boy network, but well-meaning ones are incompetent at knowing how things work beyond one level, not big picture.
Absolutely correct. That's so true. That's totally right. They don't understand how things really work. They're very good for great visions and utopian fantasies, but they don't understand how complicated things are and how much hard work is needed to make anything really work properly.
All right. And John Austin sent us another super chat. Thank you very much for that super chat, John Austin. And that's everything, Alexander.
Wow, what a wonderful program. What a great chat. By the way, I agree completely, by the way, with the sentiment that was expressed earlier, that the quality of questions we get is just amazing. And the quality of people who call us, the intellectual level is wonderful. And it's stimulating. As I said, we have these long 3-hour, 4-hour, well, it wasn't quite 4 hours last week, but it was a long one. And, I feel energized after them. It's so strange.
Yeah, our live streams are getting they're getting very long, but they're very fun and very interesting.
Absolutely.
And the calls are great. The comments are great. The super chats are amazing.
Absolutely.
Spartan Warrior Queen is amazing, moderating.
Absolutely.
Our Discord server looking great. Danny and Mitchie Melody are awesome at keeping everything running. What else can I say? That's it, Alexander. All is good in Duran world. Magnesia Shan says, good evening. Came in with a super chat. Good evening. Love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. All right. Magnesia Shan, thank you very much. On that sentiment, we will end this live stream, another Friday call-in live stream. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend. Any final words, Alexander, before we sign off?
No. No, absolutely. Just to say again, thanks so much for coming on this program. And we've covered Mr. Biden. He certainly wouldn't survive 5 seconds on our
Five, 5 seconds from you, Alex. 10 seconds. 10 seconds from you, Alexander. Any word on what's going on with Assange? He's still in prison?
He's still in prison. Absolutely, he's still in prison. We have the appeal coming up. This is the U.S. government's appeal in April. There was some talk that Assange's lawyers were going to counter appeal. They're going to argue that all the findings that Judge Baritza made against Assange were wrong, and that we're going to make all sorts of legal points. But that doesn't seem to have happened. So we've got this appeal coming up sometime in April, probably be fairly prolonged, be conducted in the High Court, and we'll see what happens.
Incredible. All right. We'll leave it there. All right, guys. Take care, everybody.